David, I just heard from Richard. He said to go ahead without him, that he can hear, but unfortunately, I guess he doesn't have a way to speak to us.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Chair. Then I'll turn it over to you and we can commence. If we could just bring up the agenda on the screen, please. I'll pass over to you, Chair.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for your indulgence. Maybe the hardest thing we do today is just to get the technology working so we can communicate. So sometimes it's harder than other times. Anyway, I just want to thank everyone for gathering. Note that we have refashioned the interim meeting this year into a one-day virtual format for efficiency's sake. So a little bit of a new approach. David, Mark, and I will welcome any comments about this new format afterwards from commissioners, staff, and public participants as well. I guess bear with us, but we're trying something new in the interest of trying to be efficient. I'm aware that this time slot overlaps with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee meeting. That was an unavoidable conflict due to Commissioner Waddell's travel schedule, and we were just looking for a date where we could make the interim meeting work. So apologies to Ian Stewart in particular, who plays a big role in this meeting as well as that Scientific and Statistical Committee meeting for the North Pacific Council. On the U.S. side, a number of processes are running behind due to our reduced staffing and the recent government shutdown. And one of the things running behind is our customary discussions with stakeholders that are helpful to initiate in advance of the interim meeting. So apologies to the public for that, and we will be in touch soon to schedule discussions in advance of the annual meeting. Thanks to the Secretariat team for compiling all the information. I look forward to the discussion. And Mark, anything from your perspective?
No, other than apologizing, as you've already noted, for my own travel, which was to ICAT for tuna, Atlantic tuna, and swordfish. But otherwise, let's get going, recognizing we've already chewed up a certain amount of time with our tech troubles. Thanks.
Okay, very good. So we have a draft agenda in front of us. Are there any amendments to the agenda? All right, well, let's go ahead and adopt the agenda. And Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Chair. And so as you've just pointed out, we have come up with a slightly different format for the interim meeting. And that includes providing a lot of the material we have in the past simply for information, with the intention of not presenting some of the papers that you would normally see. So if we look at the agenda itself, we have agenda item 3, which is all about the IPHC process, and there are 5 specific agenda items that the Commission would typically review. Paper 03, which is under agenda item 3.1, is the update on actions arising from the 101st session of the annual meeting and any intersessional decisions. Again, as I was saying, this paper is simply provided for information at this point, and you will hear updates on a range of those actions arising throughout the rest of today. And then we'll be providing a detailed presentation of those actions arising at the upcoming annual meeting. The only paper that I will highlight for action associated with that actions arising paper is provided at information paper 02, is an analysis detailing the biological, logistical, and socioeconomic effects of year-round fishing in Canada. And this was a request from the Commission to provide that information. The authors do intend on providing a full update at the upcoming annual meeting as part of that process, but in the lead up to the fishery regulations developmental process, you are referred to information paper 02 for a summary or a collation of information relevant to that request from IM101. And so I'll just pause there to see if there are any questions on the actions arising and in particular information paper 02. So back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. So I do have a couple of comments and questions related to that, but let me see if any of my fellow commissioners do first. Okay, well, maybe I'll go ahead and others can jump in if you think of anything. I'm interested in, first of all, thank you to the Secretariat for putting together that information paper too. I'm interested in the sort of the implications of this, of the potential allowance of a year-round commercial fishery in Area 2B. And I guess just to be direct, whether this could potentially be a slippery slope towards allowing, or the desire to allow, broader retention of halibut bycatch, and it's sort of a worst case scenario, perhaps decreased efforts to avoid halibut bycatch, which would not be a good thing. I guess I'm wondering if in the paper for the annual meeting, the Secretariat might be able to add a few things. One is if it's possible for any further analysis or description of how Canada would intend to ensure no expansion of directed fishing effort if this were allowed. Second is if it's possible to have any discussion of additional information on the extent to which high prices combined with an early season premium price might potentially create an incentive to maximize harvest of whatever amount is considered allowable. And then the third, which I recognize may get into perhaps a speculative nature, is there any evaluation that the Secretariat can provide of whether approving this proposal might lead to pressure from other commercial fishery sectors in both countries? So, for example, including in the United States, the IM101 fishery, the non-pollock groundfish fishery, to be allowed to retain halibut bycatch, and implications of that for meeting our objectives for non-directed halibut mortality. Again, those are just three concepts that struck me as perhaps meriting a little bit more discussion, and I guess I'm hoping that the Secretary can do that between now and the annual meeting.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. I'll pass to Dr. Kuchnichak, who can provide a little bit more elaboration. Go ahead, Pasha.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your questions and comments. So, as discussed during the work meeting, we refined the paper that's currently published for the interim meeting to focus on this narrow defined retention provision that is limited to recent discard mortality levels. So that would apply only to this limited volume of fish. In the current assessment, as requested, we did not consider any further opening, and as a result of that, we did not look into those type of incentives that potentially could be created, as you mentioned in your comments. We can certainly look into it. I believe in this case, we would need to work really closely with Fisheries Oceans Canada to understand what measures would have to be put in place and what measures they would recommend to put in place in order to ensure that this fishery would not expand into something that is more direct, more incentivized, and expanding over time. So, as I would suggest, if your recommendation was to move forward with this further analysis, and I will note in order to prepare that for the annual meeting, it's relatively short timeline, but we can certainly work with the Fisheries Ocean Canada to get something a little bit more about the safeguards that could be put in place. But of course, some of this, whether the prices will be high and how much premium would that be, and whether there would be pressure from other sectors, as you said, that could be pretty speculative. I at this time we would have to discuss it, I guess, internally. What could be provided?
The browser that wasn't.
Sorry, there was just some echo. What could be provided, and what level of information would provide more of as a potential option, a potential, like what could potentially happen versus. I believe we would not be able to provide anything for certain in terms of providing feedback on these comments.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Again, recognizing there may be limitations on what can be pulled together in the time that's available, but to the extent you can address those points I mentioned, I'd appreciate it. And I'll just note, Commissioner Yamada has joined us. Welcome, Richard.
So are there any clarifications Canadian commissioners would like to make at this point on that request, or shall we move on, Chair?
Mark, anything?
Certainly, I think we can readily work with yourselves, David and the Secretariat Company, with regards to advising us the management measures that could be put in place should this proceed. But the intention, from my understanding, was always to be a non-directed fishery. So this, is meant to be that, but we can seek to clarify that with yourselves and make sure we have the information available for our collective decisions and deliberations over the course of the annual meeting in January.
Okay. Fantastic.
May I chime in? I don't know if people can see my hand up.
I did not see your hand, but go ahead, Neil.
Thank you, John. I think one or two things to clarify. Certainly we can work to try and describe in more detail responses to those questions, but maybe one very important point is the proposal here is about fisheries that already have access and are authorized to retain and sell halibut commercially. So it's not about providing fleets that are not authorized. Like, we're not bringing new fleets into the halibut fishery here. They already have access, and their access comes out of the commercial TAC. So I think, with respect, John, to your questions about, well, what about maybe the Amendment 80 fleet or other fleets that are not currently permitted to retain, I think that's a really key distinction, is at least in the context of how we would frame the proposal. We're talking about fleets that are already authorized. They're already part of the commercial halibut fishery, not about fleets that would be sort of gaining access to the commercial halibut fishery. But having said that, I think those are important questions, and we can certainly try to work with the Secretary in providing more detail between now and the annual meeting.
That's great, and an important distinction that you made too. So thank you for that. So I don't appear to be able to see raised hands at all. So commissioners, I guess I just encourage you to speak up verbally if. Well, looks like the Secretariat may be adding that feature. So very good. All right, David, with that, I think we're ready to move on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chair. The next agenda item 3.2 and 3.3 are simply provided for information. The report of the Secretariat is simply in draft format at the moment, noting that the paper deadline was 30 days ago and we still have a couple of months left of the calendar year. And so a full and detailed report of the Secretariat will be provided for the annual meeting and presented accordingly. Similarly, the reports of the IPHC subsidiary bodies under agenda item 3.3 are all provided for information. And when we get to the relevant sections in today's meeting agenda, any relevant recommendations or actions arising from those subsidiary bodies will be spoken to. And then similarly for agenda item 3.4, it's the IPHC Integrated Research and Monitoring Plan that's currently being developed. And the intention there is to incorporate some of the requests that were made by the Scientific Review Board in September of this year, and have that integrated research and monitoring plan presented at the Commission meeting in January of next year. The intention there is to have the plan implemented by late 2026, noting that the current 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring extends until the end of June 2026. So I'll pause there before jumping on to agenda item 3.5 and see if there are any questions from commissioners. Over to you, Chair.
Okay, Commissioners, any questions, comments? So I had one, David, on the Research Advisory Board's report, which I noted in the report, it included a focus on what was termed in quotes, the alleged illegal retention and landing of Pacific halibut by non-target sectors for processing into fish meal. And that comes up in the executive summary of the report and in paragraph 33. And the Research Advisory Board recommended that IPHC should obtain, quote, a clear indication of what is being removed and the likely impacts on the halibut resource, close quote. So I just wanted to address that briefly. I'm not sure why the Research Advisory Board chose to speak to a management and enforcement issue, but the implication there is that significant halibut bycatch may be occurring that is not being accounted for in that fishery off Kodiak, and that is not correct. The issue, as I understand it, primarily involved vessels participating in what's referred to as the Trawl Electronic Monitoring Program, which is a program that has 100% electronic monitoring coverage. And the vessels are required to retain all of their bycatch, all their prohibited species catch, until they come to shore and human observers can fully account for it. And then the bycatch must be either discarded or donated. It can't enter commerce in any form. The news article that was referenced in the RAB report referenced an investigation by the Alaska Wildlife Troopers, and the National Marine Fisheries Service can't comment beyond what the Wildlife Troopers' public statements have been, but the reported allegations have to do with whether halibut was being processed into fish meal and entering commerce. And regardless of whether that happened, all the prohibited species catch, all the bycatch in the trawl electronic monitoring program is fully accounted for. And the data on halibut bycatch are incorporated into the IPHC's processes and calculations for the stock assessment and non-directed discard mortality, et cetera. So I just wanted to mention that because it's something that stood out to me in the Research Advisory Board's report.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. And I'll just echo what you've just indicated, and that was more or less communicated in the same way to the RAB participants at the time. But the participants were very keen to see that recommendation in the report itself. And so at this point, it's just a matter of collating that information and just finding a way to re-communicate what you've just indicated to interested stakeholders. But the Secretariat did make it very clear that, as you said, all that information is already gathered at the time. I also see Commissioner de Grief's hand was up.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I just had a quick question on the integrated research and monitoring plan, and it had to do with the goals on AI, and in particular with fishing practices as a defined problem, and how AI would benefit fishing yields. And I'm just hoping to get a little explanation on that, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. At this point, we don't have too much. It's a case of us looking into how we're going to potentially use AI in a whole range of things. And that at the moment is simply incorporated into the plan as a very broad, generic intention of coming up with a strategy of how to use AI in as many areas as we feel appropriate or useful. So at this point, unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer. Just looking at the rest of the team. Yeah, I'm going to pass to Dr. Hicks for a moment.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner de Grief. I think a lot of that statement too is just staying on top of the research that's currently going on in fisheries related to AI. We know that there's, it's in its infancy, but there's there's a lot of research that's suggesting AI might be useful in fisheries, such as forecasting certain quantities, even using it to analyze different harvest strategies. So it's just a statement in there to make sure we stay on top of that research and are aware of it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other hands, Chair.
Okay, well, let's move on.
Okay, thank you very much. Agenda item 3.5, it relates to amendments to the rules of procedure. And so if you could just have paper 16 brought up on the screen, please. Okay, so paper 16 is requesting that the Commission approve proposed amendments to the IPHC rules of procedure in two specific points. The first is relating to Rule 13, and this is a simple removal of reference to the Assistant Director, noting that the Chair and Vice Chair have removed the position from the Secretariat, so it's more of an administrative amendment to Rule 13. And then more substantively is Rule 14, which relates to subsidiary bodies, and more specifically Appendix 4, the terms of reference and rules of procedure for the Conference Board. And there are three primary proposed changes that have been, or that are being requested to the Conference Board rules of procedure. I'm going to pass to Dr. Hutchmazak, who's going to walk you through those three amendments and also the consultative process that was undertaken with the Conference Board and the co-chairs. So, Basha, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So the proposed changes, they're in three separate areas. One is simplified reaccreditation for active members. And this is a change that is being proposed in order to make the process during the annual meeting just more efficient. This change reduces administrative effort while ensuring continuity for active participants. And with this change, all the participants will not have to resubmit their reaccreditation forms every 5 years, as long as they were confirmed as being active members. And this is defined in the rules of procedures as participating in at least 3 out of 5 last meetings. We also propose some changes that are clarifying reporting process. This is to focus on key discussions of outcomes, and in order to make the process again more efficient, we clarified that the oral statements made during the meeting will continue to be captured in the official recording, and the summaries of positions and viewpoints will appear in the written reports, and written statements may be still included upon request in the report of the Conference Board. But as a secretariat, in order to make the process more efficient, we just clarified that oral statements during the meetings are sufficient. They are recorded during the meeting, and they are made available to the public right after the meeting. So this is just making sure it's really clear what are the options to express various views, including minority views, to the Conference Board members. And the last change is just a couple of editorial improvements to improve the readability and consistency of the document format. As a part of the consultations, we reach out to co-chairs of Conference Board, both co-chair from United States and Canada, and discuss these changes. They consulted with their board members, as well as the IPHC Secretariat organized a Q&A session to explain the proposed changes and answer any questions that any board members have. As a result, both co-chairs sent us an email that stated that they agree with the proposed changes and agree that the proposed changes may be brought to the Commission. Thank you.
So that's the quick overview, commissioners, and I believe we also have the co-chairs of the Conference Board online who are available if you do require any additional confirmation regarding proposed amendments. But with that, Chair, we would seek that the Commission consider the amendments being proposed and adopt the revised rules of procedure by consensus. So I'll pass back to you. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioners, any comments or questions? Not seeing any. So, David, I think we can consider that adopted by consensus.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chair. So that concludes agenda item 3. And so we move on to agenda item 4 at this point. And so just flip to paper presentation for paper 07, please. Now, under agenda item 4.1.1, which is an update on the fishery dependent data overview and more specifically the port operations in 2025. This is one of those papers that we're not going to present today, but is simply provided for information for the interim meeting and will be presented in full at the upcoming annual meeting. But that said, we will be presenting a abbreviated version of paper 07, which relates specifically to the fisheries data collected. So I'll pass over to Basha again to present that.
Yes, thank you. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide a summary of the 2025 Pacific halibut removal. We'll focus on the status of mortality relative to the mortality and fishery limits adopted by the Commission and outlined in the 2025 IPHC fishery regulations. Can I please have a next slide? The figures presented today include current and end-of-year mortality projections for 2025 as of 5th November 2025. And this is aligning with the data that has been made available to the stock assessment analysis. These values, please keep in mind, they remain preliminary and they will be updated once more complete data is becoming available for the annual. And as a reminder, in-season updates are also published twice a month on the IPHC website and are available. Oh, there. At the current 2025 total projected TCY mortality is 12,247 tons or 27 million pounds. And this represents 91% of the coast-wide TCY. Mortality limit attainment varies substantially across IPHC regulatory areas and as currently projected ranged from 31% in IPHC regulatory area 4B to 104% in regulatory area 2C. These differences reflect combined contributions of all sectors to the total mortality within each IPHC regulatory area. And I will note that I do have additional slides with sector-specific and area-specific details, and these are available to be presented if requested to the Commission. These include breakdowns of commercial recreational subsistence and discard mortality components, but I will leave it here and just provide these. Thank you.
So passing back to you, Chair, to see if there are any specific questions. We do have Commissioner de Grief's hand up.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. One quick question, and it doesn't have to be answered now, but I was curious about in Alaska, there was some level of mortality through pot fisheries. I think it was like 22,500 pounds landed. I was curious if that was over a number of deliveries or if it was someone went out and targeted using pots and, you know, was successful. So.
Thank you for this question. I would need to verify with the team how many deliveries this represent. I do not have that number at hand, but I can certainly provide that. But yeah, these are the deliveries that were available during, especially potentially retained under the quota system for the trips that were primary sablefish trips.
Okay, thank you very much.
Basha, is there anything you can you would care to elaborate on with regard to the exceedance in 2C or the low percent attained in 4B?
Certainly. So the high percentage in IPHC regulatory area 2C is primarily due to a substantially higher than initially estimated attainment of mortality in unguided recreational sector. Please note that this sector is not subject to limit, but we when we report the values against TCUI, we report for sectors that are not subject to fishery limits, we report the mortality against the projections that were initially used in the setting the TCUIs. So the mortality in 2C unguided sector has been increasing, and it's increasing in terms of the percentage of that initial projection versus the actual mortality. In IPHC regulatory area 4B, the low attainment of quota, this is primarily due to low attainment of the quota in the commercial sector. And this has been seen over time. As you can see, a comparison in percent attained between 2024 and 2025. 4B has been low over the last at least 2 years. It's not been attaining its overall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bob?
Yes, the question I have is for the non-directed commercial discard mortality. That's usually divided between the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. Was there a higher amount in both areas generated, or did that come from one area or the other? Meaning that we're at 111% of what we estimated, it looks like.
Certainly. So for the non-directed commercial discard mortality, if we look at the area 3A, that was at about 80%. In 3B, the non-directed commercial discard mortality, the U26 component, was 117% for 3B. In area 4A, that was 147%. In area 4B, that was actually 190%. And area 4C and E, it was 94%. So in general, yes, area 3B were higher than initial projections, and 4A and 4B. In terms of O26 component for the non-directed commercial discard mortality, area 2C was very close to the initial projections at 102%. 3A, very close to the initial projections, also 102%. In area 3B, that would be under about 95% of the initial projection. In 4A, that would be 101, so close to the initial projection. In 4B, 91%. And in 4C and E, that was at 120%. So as you can see, it varied. But again, these are components of the O26 is a component of TCUI that is not subject to a specific limit, but it's assessed against the projection.
So that's a percent of O26, not of O32?
Yes, for the non-directed commercial discard mortality, we separated between the O26 and U26.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Not seeing any, Dave.
Fantastic. In addition to that, there is also information paper 03. We thought about where to locate this paper, but it relates or summarizes the information available on the use of AI for determining the age of fish from otoliths. And so I'll just pass to Basha to see if there is anything in particular you wanted to highlight regarding information paper 03. Basha.
Thank you. So for this paper is an update of the research that we've been conducting at the IPHC now for some time. We will be working on more substantial revision and updated results as we now connect the new images. We had some help with volunteers from the University of Washington that were helping us over the spring, summer, fall to take some additional images. And with the larger base for training the AI type model for age predictions, we will be able to revise the model and provide more updated results next year. But this current paper is the state of the model that we previously discussed during the work meeting. There's no substantial update since then, but as I said, we are planning a large update next year with a substantially increased amount of training data.
So that's just presented for information at this point, Chair. And so if there's no specific questions, we can move on to the next agenda item.
Okay, not seeing any questions.
Okay, well, that closes agenda item 4.1. Moving on to 4.2 is the fishery independent data overview, and more specifically, the 2025 Fishery Independent Setline Survey Design and Implementation. So this is paper 08, and the presentation for it will be made by Kayla Orlesi. And so if you could just make Kayla a presenter, that should be able to navigate directly. Thank you, Secretary. Over to you, Kayla.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to run through my entire presentation, but try to go through it pretty quickly. And please feel free to ask any questions at the end. So I'll just be running through the 2025 Fishery Independent Setline Survey Design and Implementation. As a reminder to you all, the primary objective for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is standardized fishery independent data collection for the Pacific halibut stock assessment and stock distribution estimation. And we are striving to achieve this primary objective through the collection of biological data, such as sex data, maturity, age, and additional. Both our gear and bait are standardized for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. Both fixed gear and snap gear vessels are eligible to submit bids each year. For 2025, we did not have any snap gear vessels participate. Only fixed gear vessels participated in the FIS this year. Each skate meets the following specifications: 1,800 feet with 100 hooks spaced 18 feet apart. Number 3 circle hooks are threaded through the front on 24 to 48 inch ganyons, and 7 to 10 pound weights are placed on each non-anchored skate end. In 2025, we resumed the use of only frozen chum salmon, number 2 semi-bright. As you would note, in 2024, we did use pink salmon as well, but this year we just resumed using solely chum salmon. This bait was cut from 1/4 to 1/3 pound, and the captains as well as our field staff on board worked together to ensure that all bait met our quality standards, and captain signed off on this bait quality. This image shows the 515 stations that were planned for the 2025 Fishery Independent Setline Survey. This year's survey ran from the 30th of May to the 5th of September, in comparison to 2024, when the survey ran from the 24th of May to the 15th of August, and in 2023, when it ran from the 26th of May to the 1st of September. There were 6 vessels that participated in the 2025 survey. in comparison to 5 vessels in 2024 and 8 vessels in 2023. As I just mentioned, 515 stations were planned for the survey in comparison to 525 stations in 2024 and 958 stations in 2023. This next graphic will give you a better idea of what stations were effectively sampled, what stations were deemed ineffective. This year, this graphic looks a little bit more complicated because while we had planned stations, we also had stations that were planned that were then not sampled for various reasons or substituted. And we also had supplementary stations that were coming from our catch protection study that was conducted in the 4A Edge area. There we go. So I will leave that there and feel free to ask any questions on this at the end. We had 22 total ineffective stations for the 2025 FIS. As is standard, the majority of these ineffective stations were due to whale depredation, 10 of which from sperm whale depredation and 6 of which from orca depredation. We also had a small spattering of others due to pinniped depredation, some shark depredation, 1 due to sand fleas, and then 2 due to gear issues. Those 2 were out in Area 4 due to like tidal issues and ultimately not being able to be hauled within the 24-hour time limit that we have set. This graphic just shows the percentage and comparing the 2025 FIS through various surveys dating back to 1998. The 2025 survey had 4.22% deemed ineffective, which is relatively comparable if you look for the past few years, particularly when Area 4 is done. I will note, if I go back to this last slide, while most years Area 4 presents the most ineffective stations due to whale depredation, we actually saw more ineffective stations in 3A this year with sperm whales. This navy blue color will show whale depredation throughout the years, and as we all are very well aware, that makes up the vast majority of stations deemed ineffective. The secondary objective is cost effectiveness without compromising scientific integrity of the FIS design, which we strive to achieve through our fish sale process as well as our charter agreements. In our fish sale process, as we have been completing in the past few years, we do complete multi-port bidding when feasible. This year we did this particularly in 3A ports, which did help to increase competition in multiple ports. In addition to achieve our secondary objective, we do sell all sampled U32 Pacific halibut. In 2025, the price of our sublegal halibut was 26% less than the legal sized average price. And the tertiary objective is collaboration. In 2025, we collaborated with NOAA Fisheries to complete Pacific cod and spiny dogfish sampling coastwide. We also collaborated with ADF&G, particularly in 3A in the Prince William area for dockside rockfish sampling. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife collaborated with us to complete 8 rockfish index stations off the coast of Washington, as well as dockside rockfish sampling in all Washington offloads. And we also collaborated with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for the few offloads we had in Oregon as well. In years past, we have collaborated in 2B with DFO, Archipelago, and PHMA to conduct dockside rockfish sampling. However, this has been on hold for the past couple of years, but there are ongoing discussions. Moving forward, these links will bring you to the IPHC website where you can view 2025 FIS results. And then we'll go into some of the financial details. For the 2025 FIS, we saw a coastwide average price of $8.18 in comparison to 2024, where we had a coastwide average price of $6.22. Of note, in 2B and in 2C, we did have an average price very close to $10. I do want to note that 2C catch was offloaded in Prince Rupert, which is why those prices are so similar. This graphic provides a comparison of the average price with prices adjusted for inflation from 2025 dating back to 2000. And you can see, again, that the average price for 2025 was $8.18. And that's comparable to the 2020 and 2021 price points that we were seeing. For this year's survey, our coastwide total was $2,154,485 in comparison to the $2,099,722 in 2024. It is worth noting, however, that in addition to our standard FIS stations in 2024, we did complete vessel captain stations, which allowed there to be an inflated catch in some of these stations, which then resulted in a little bit more revenue being generated as well. And this further compares this year to last year. Again, as I just mentioned, 2024 did have those vessel captain stations as well, but ultimately for the coastwide station per station count, we had a average station rate of $4,088 for 2025 in comparison to just shy of $4,000 in 2024. And with that, I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Kayla, commissioners, any questions? Bob.
I got a question. My hand didn't come up.
Yeah, I see you. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, so Carla, on the I think it was the slide, I just wrote it down. Slide 5, the stations off of Oregon, were they completed? Were they part of? I noticed in the survey it showed 2A down 10%. Were they part of that? Did you guys do those stations?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, we did complete our planned stations in Oregon. Overall, the 2A catch was considerably lower, and I'll leave further discussions on catch rates to Ian and Ray to discuss further. However, yes, in 2A in particular, we did see a relatively significant reduced catch. But all of the Oregon stations that we had planned to complete were completed.
And then you mentioned rockfish stations. Do you do specific stations for the state of Oregon or Washington just for rockfish that are not normally a halibut? What I want to say, station.
Thank you. Yeah. So for the state of Washington, we do have a memo of understanding, but with them, with the collaboration, and we complete 8 additional stations around station 1052, I believe, off the coast of Washington, and those are our rockfish index stations. And with those stations, we conduct 4 skates of standard FIS gear, and then we attach an additional skate with their scientific gear as well. And we also collaborate with them to complete dockside rockfish sampling for all Washington offloads. For the state of Oregon, we do not complete additional work. However, we do notify them when we are offloading in the state of Oregon, and they come down after our offload is complete and then sample any rockfish that we catch during the FIS.
Okay, thank you for that.
Peter?
Yeah, thank
Peter, we're not hearing you.
Under the now?
It's kind of breaking up. I'm not sure if that's true for everyone.
Yeah.
Sounds like yes. Try again, Peter.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I will. Oh, you can? Okay.
Yep.
My question was whether the fecundity or the whale studies were included in the financials for prices and the analysis of.
No, they were not. All the financials that are presented in this presentation are strictly for the FIS. Even, and I know I mentioned on this slide here, we had those 6 stations. Those stations met all of our FIS tender specifications. That's why they were added to this slide. But any financial data from any of our additional studies were not included in this presentation.
Okay.
Seeing any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Then we can move on to agenda item 5. And so it's more specifically agenda item 5.1. And Dr. Webster is going to present the presentation associated with paper 09, Rev 1. What to use? Yes, perfect. Thank you. So over to Dr. Webster. Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. This will be a relatively brief presentation on modeling of the survey data for 2025. That includes modeling of all data that we've collected this and the complementary calibrated troll survey and Alaska Department of Fish and Game troll survey from 1993 onwards. So we've been using space-time models for a number of years now to model both 32 and all sizes weight per unit effort and numbers per unit effort indices. For 4A and 4CD, the modeling uses data from the FIS and agency troll surveys, and with the calibration to convert the troll data to a FIS equivalent. In 2025, the NOAA survey was undertaken in the Eastern Bering Sea and the Northern Bering Sea, while the Alaska Department of Fish and Game survey was in Norton Sound, which is also intended to be an annual survey, was not undertaken this year. Other areas use FIS data only, and the raw station data are adjusted for hook competition and timing of the FIS relative to the fish route. The modeling predicts weight per unit effort and numbers per unit effort at all stations on the FIS grid and on the NOAA grid in the Bering Sea, whether these are surveyed in a given year or not. The estimates are calculated as averages across station predictions. The estimates overall indices for a regulatory area or a margin management unit. Lack of sampling or reduced sampling is reflected in greater uncertainty, higher variances, or coefficients of variation. Official estimates are computed for biological regions, IPHC regulatory areas, and coast-wide convention waters from San Francisco Bay to the Bering Strait. Station level output is supplied to the online IPHC Spacetime Explorer tool, which we're working on updating for 2025, and it's available on the website. So the updates and data for 2025. So this information that was included in the survey that Kayla's already reviewed. In all, we had FIS sampling in all IPHC regulatory areas except for CDE. And we had, as I mentioned, our troll survey in the Eastern Bering Sea, including Northern Bering Sea stations, and that's indicated in the data we used from that survey indicated at the red triangles in the Bering Sea. The orange circles represent the stations that we sampled and were effectively sampled, that we, in other words, we could use the data for modeling and estimation. We also have these unsampled or ineffective stations indicated and Bering Sea troll survey stations as well. So by biological region, these are the time series estimates for 032 weight per unit effort from 1993 to 2025. And probably of most interest is the change from 2024 to 2025, which is indicated in the numbers in the bottom left-hand corner of each figure. So region 2, we estimate to be down by 11% in 2024. Region 3 up 6%. Region 4 up 5%, 4B 2%, but coastwide, combining all of those regions, we estimated no change from 2024. All sizes, weight per unit effort by biological region, some pretty similar to 032, but some small differences with an overall coastwide change estimated of -2%. And so likewise for numbers per unit effort, a coastwide change of -2%, but with increases in regions 4 and 4B and a decrease in region 2. Now it's worth noting in parts of, we're not sampling all stations in all years, and particularly 2025, as the year before, had a reduced survey footprint. But some areas like 2A, this was the first significant sampling we've done for 3 years. We had a small survey in northern Washington in 2023, and no survey in 2024. So this gives us a chance to see how the survey time series is revised once information becomes available when it was lagging for a couple of years. It gives you a sense of the type of biases that might creep into estimates when we have a greatly reduced or no survey occurring. And so you can see in red in this in the time series, the red time series represents what we estimated up until the end of 2024. And based on the information we had, which was some quite high catch rates in the north of Washington in 2023 and no data in 2024, we estimated relatively high index for those 2 years. Once the information was updated with 2025 data, that not only led to a lower estimate for 2025, but also revised the estimates in the intermediate years between the last significant survey in 2022. It revised those estimates downwards. And you can see we had a lot of uncertainty represented by the width of the shaded regions in the estimate for 2024. And that uncertainty has been reduced somewhat due to the survey taking place in 2025. Similarly in 4A, but in the opposite direction, we had estimated based on very little data in recent years, some data from the NOAA Troll survey that overlaps 4A, and some information that leads into modeling from 3B. But we estimated very low catch rates in index values over the last couple of years, but we had higher than expected catch rates in the 2025 survey in 4A. This is, this is all sizes weight per unit effort. We had quite a lot of U32 fish in the FIS in 2025. So the index was up in 2025 over what we were anticipating, and it also led to revised values for particularly the index for the last 2 years as well. 4B was a case where we actually got a value from the survey that was relatively consistent with what we had estimated previously, 2024. And so while the index hasn't changed a lot, we have more confidence in the index that we've got. You'll notice that we had quite wide shaded regions in red for 2024, and that's been reduced due to the addition of information we got in the 2025 survey. 2A, we had the CCAT water column profilers in operation this year, and that was provided us very valuable information to help understand what was going on in some parts of the stock, particularly in 2A, where dissolved oxygen levels were lower in 2025 than the last time we had an extensive survey in 2022. So this map shows probably easier to see, hopefully on your own screens, but it shows dissolved oxygen level. There's a colored bar indicating the level of oxygen. Past research that we've done and published indicates that a level of 1 milliliter per liter dissolved oxygen below that, 0.9 milliliters per liter below that level, we tend to see no halibut at all. Above that level, halibut can exist and be caught in reasonable numbers. So there does appear to be a threshold at which an area becomes uninhabitable for halibut, and there were some small areas off Oregon and Washington coasts which are indicated with dashed white lines that were below that threshold. Overall, compared to 2022, dissolved oxygen levels were down across the coast, but for the most part, they were above the threshold. The major concerns that this change in dissolved oxygen will have an impact on the survey. We note that the change in the index for 2025 for 2A was consistent with the change we're estimating for both 2B and 2C. We did not observe any areas of complexity in those regions. So noting that the 2A value is an estimated change from what we now estimate to be the value in 2024, which was revised from a higher value from last year. But that revised estimate change is consistent across regions. And the recommendation is to note the paper, and that'll take questions.
Thanks, Ray. Any questions? Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. What happens to stations that have dissolved oxygen? Are they not included in the space-time modeling, or are they discounted?
They are included. We make no adjustment for those stations. The fish were not there, go to 0, and that's a valuable piece of information. There is a likelihood that because halibut are mobile and it takes time for the dissolved oxygen levels to change, that they have an opportunity to move out of the area, and then a catch presumed to be catchable somewhere else. Of course, this year we're not sampling everywhere, and there's a chance that they moved into an area that we did not sample, and that is something that can be taken into consideration when interpreting.
Okay, thank you. Another question was, in terms of the space-time model, you can see that the lack of data can project things moving forward, like such as you had in 2A, where it was over, and in 4, I believe 4A, it was underperforming. And so I wonder, are there any adjustments to the space-time model? Is there anything you've learned here that can help the space-time model perform better in the future? Thank you.
I mean, really what this speaks to is the potential for bias when we're not sampling areas on a regular basis. So it's not really something regarding tweaking the model or adjusting how the model works. It just emphasizes that revisiting areas on a frequent basis in order to capture that change is crucial to understanding what's going on in stock trends. We can't predict which direction this was going to go. We could say that I mean, it's not consistent whether it's up or down. We have 2A slower than the model had estimated last year. 4A was higher than the model had estimated last year. There's no additional information that we have available at the moment that would allow us to improve those estimates. So
yeah, just more sampling is basically what we need to be
more
doing.
regular sampling.
And probably in areas where we don't sample all the time, try to incorporate them more.
Right, and it's Yeah, and it's worth noting we only fished 30 stations in 4B out of 200 something stations, and 28 stations and 4 supplementary stations in 4A out of 80 whatever stations. So even our sampling was still a relatively small portion of the stock. So it's better. It's certainly an improvement to what we had in the absence of sampling, but there's still potential for unknown things going on.
And could you just speak to Region 3 a little bit as well? Because you mentioned 2 and 3, and it was my understanding that some of the sampling in 3 was down, but it was not down as much as had been modeled. Am I incorrect in that interpretation?
So I'm not I may be misunderstanding the question, but in the areas that we did sample in area 3, we had higher catch rates than we were expecting. In Prince William Sound and the Yakutat regions that we sampled in 3A. And that's incorporated in the model, but so we do have an increase projected, an increase estimated for region 3, based largely on sampling in 3A. And you find the regulatory area breakdowns in the paper, in the appendix, if you want to look at area by area. And I'm not sure if that was what you were asking, Commissioner Dickery.
Yeah, I guess it was just that even though the station was probably down from last time you sampled it, the model had predicted that it would be down more. And so therefore it's actually up because it had been predicting that those stations would just be down more. That was my understanding. But
yeah, I believe that's a correct understanding, that the projections that were made prior to the survey incorporated adjustments for trends over. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ray. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Richard?
Yeah, Ray, I have 2 questions regarding dissolved oxygen. One is every station records kept on dissolved oxygen? And number 2, how long has this been going? Is there a correlation between the dissolved oxygen and the FISC? Has there been enough historical data to kind of have a correlation where the dissolved oxygen is either positive or negative, and you see a FISC correlation between the 2?
Thank you for the questions, Commissioner Yamada. First question, I believe we've been doing this on putting the CCATs out there on a regular basis since 2009. So we have quite a long time series, and this is in every area. We have some data due to damage or loss of equipment, but in general, we have information on all stations since 2009. There was a gap in the series last year when we did not have the CCATs operational, but otherwise that information is available. And second question, yes, I think it was last year we published a paper with former staff member Laurie Sidoris as lead author with the modeling of the relationship between dissolved oxygen and catch rate in 2A. And there is a clear relationship, particularly this cutoff below 0.9 milliliters per liter, and a somewhat more nuanced relationship above that. But in general, yeah, we have published that work and had to provide the link to the paper.
Just to follow up, so has this been, could you apply that to all the other regulatory areas where you got that data?
We can model, we can certainly add those areas to the modeling, but area 2A is the one area where we have a high contrast in value, where we regularly have values that go below that threshold. We might have the occasional station in other areas, but there's not really enough information to inform that relationship as well as it is in 2A. And so when I say we've modeled it, that we model it in order to understand those relationships, but that's not incorporated into the space-time modeling for producing the index value. It's just an underlying environmental variable that we treat it as an underlying environmental variable, like temperature or pH or something that might impact halibut, but we want to measure those impacts, so we don't make any kind of adjustment for that in the model. Same way we treat depth. It helps us predict in stations. It's different depths. We have a depth relationship, so we can better predict when we're not sampling. But otherwise, where it would be beneficial is if we were able to get dissolved oxygen information in areas where we're not sampling. Then we could inform our prediction of catch rates and the index values in areas outside of our sampling footprint, but that's not it.
May I ask another question? Is this dissolved oxygen vary on the water column? Like, more oxygen at the surface, less oxygen in the bottom? Is it throughout the water column?
I believe so, and I believe the timing and the intensity varies with depth. We do have the entire column sample, but we're using the bottom values in the presentation here and in the modeling because those are most pertinent to where the halibut is sampled.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Bob.
Yeah, Ray. A question similar to Richard's. I haven't seen you mentioned in the past dissolved oxygen issues off of British Columbia, Gulf of Alaska, or the Bering Sea. Is this something that is typically an issue sometimes in 2A and not very prevalent elsewhere in our sampling?
Yes, I looked at it's essentially a 2A issue. I did look at the historical data recently, and we do find occasional stations that which go below this threshold or near it. But there's no consistent areas of hypoxia like we see in 2A that show up, where you might have a cluster of stations. Like see a little bit here, but more, I think, was it 2017, we had the last big hypoxic event off the Washington, Oregon coast. So I haven't seen that in the historical data. It's more like a station here and there.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Ray, I just wanted to build on your back and forth with Commissioner DeGrief, and maybe the best way to do that is focus on slide 8 for 2A, where you were talking about the revisions to the model results from 2023 and 2024 based on adding the 2025 data. And I wonder if you could just elaborate on that a little bit. Can you maybe describe how it is that the model results come to be revised for a previous year based on the 2025 data?
Yes, thank you for the question, Commissioner Curlin. Yes, happy to do that. So the model incorporates, with the technical answer first, and then explain what that means. It incorporates estimates spatial dependence in time and in, it estimates dependence correlation in time and in space. So it recognizes that halibut distribution is patchy, and those patches tend to persist over multiple years. So you don't have a patch of halibut showing up somewhere in one year and then it's completely gone the next year. A fishing spot remains consistently good for a period of time, or consistently bad for a period of time, due to presumably habitat and environmental conditions and so on. Those correlations are estimated within the model. So that means that when we're trying to estimate, say, a value for a particular station, what informs that station's value is not just the information we got this year at that station, but information from adjacent stations and information from that station and adjacent stations the year before and the year before that. Now that correlation is estimated to decline over time. The further you go back in time, the less relevant that information is to the current year. So the most recent data inform that. And so this is what's going on here and it goes backwards in time too. So if we sample a station that hasn't been sampled in a couple of years, that information that we got this year then informs the estimate that we got helps revise the estimate that we got last year in the absence of sometimes in the absence of data or in the presence of relatively little. So everything's connected, and we make use of those connections in calculating and revising estimates. Does that help?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it does. Thanks very much. Not seeing any other questions.
Okay. Chair, well, thanks very much, Dr. Webster. That brings us to agenda item 5.2. We are about 12 minutes behind schedule, so we are due for a short refreshment break at this point, Chair. So we can either take a shorter break and come back with Dr. Stewart, who's going to present agenda item 5.2, the stock assessment, or we could just continue on. So I'll leave to you to decide. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do a short break. How about 5 minutes?
5 minutes. Thanks very much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Welcome back, Chair. If you're ready, we can proceed with agenda item 5.2, and this is the stock assessment overview to be presented by Dr. Stewart, and specifically this is paper 10 Rev 1 and the associated presentation. So over to you, Chair.
Yes, please. Welcome, Dr. Stewart.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. I'll be presenting the results of this year's stock assessment. The brief summary of results for today's presentation are as follows. The coastwide trends, as you've seen from Dr. Webster, showed little change from 2024 to 2025. We are seeing new information in the age information that's indicating 2016 and 2017 year classes were the most important for both the Fishery Independent Setline Survey and the Directed Commercial Halibut Fishery in 2025. Overall, although we did a full stock assessment this year, these results are very consistent with the stock assessment from 2024, indicating both a similar trend and scale. And the stock remains in a low productivity regime that we've been tracking and began around 2006 with low recruitment at that time period. So that's the short summary. I'll go into more detail. First, in terms of the data sources from the coastwide through the regional level, we're testing out a new format with some area by area dashboards this year to provide information in a very compact and hopefully more efficient format. And then I'll go through the modeling results this year, both the modeling process, the results for this year, and our reference points. And I'll note that I'll be back after Dr. Hicks to provide the stock projections and harvest decision table in a separate presentation. So this first graphic shows you the historical mortality going back into the 1960s. I think the things to note here are that after the large decreases from the early 2000s, we had a period of stability from around 2012 to somewhere around 2020. And then over the last several years, the reductions in the mortality limits that the Commission has put in place have reduced the total mortality from all sources down to a level that's even below where we were in the late 1970s. So we are now at some of the lowest overall mortality levels for the Pacific halibut stock that we've seen in the last 100 years. To compare to the limits, so this graphic shows you at the top in blue are the TCEYs that were set in each year from 2019 onward, noting that prior to that time period, the Commission was actually not setting TCEYs, they were setting FCEYs. So what we've done is reconstruct the mortality that would have been associated with the TCEYs, and that's the dashed blue line going back all the way to 2013. The bars represent the mortality that is accruing to those limits, and this is, again, at the coastwide scale. So you'll note that up until 2020, the mortality accruing to the TCEY was very close to the combined limit across all years leading up to 2020. Beginning in 2020, we saw the fishery catching somewhat less than the TCEY at the coast-wide level, and that trend has continued through to 2025. However, the actual mortality has tracked pretty closely with the changes in mortality limits. In particular, the reductions that the Commission has made since 2022 have led to lower mortality in 23, 24, and then most recently in 2025. You've already seen some breakdown of these trends from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey from Dr. Webster. This is the same information. Now this is just at the coast-wide level. To refresh your memory, the change at the bottom, the percent change at the bottom of each panel represents the change from 2024 to 2025. And from left to right, these three panels indicate the numbers per skate on the left, the total pounds per skate in the center, and the O32 or legal pounds per skate on the right. And in contrast to some recent years where we've seen somewhat different trends across these three different metrics, from 2024 to 2025, we saw a relatively similar and relatively flat trend across all of these metrics coming from our Fishery Independent Setline Survey. We can take the O32 survey trend, which is shown here on the left, and compare to the Commercial Fishery Logbook Index, which is shown here on the right. The logbooks represent only the landed catch, and therefore the O32 weight per unit effort from our survey is the most comparable metric. And you can see in general over this period from the 1990s, we've seen very similar trends in both of these series, with a steep decline from the late 1990s through around 2010, some flattening out of the trend since then, but further decline in the weight per unit effort of legal size fish being seen in both the survey and in the commercial fishery. And the change from 2024 to 2025, flat in the survey and down 1% in the commercial fishery. Noting, however, that the data that we have in time for the stock assessment only represent data through the end of October. And of course, the commercial fishery was still operating beyond that date. So not only do we have additional fishing going on, but there are also some records that wouldn't have been collected by the end of October. Now, this has been a recurring challenge in recent stock assessments. This graphic here shows you the fishery catch rates that we had at the time each stock assessment was done, going back several years into the past. And then in red is the time series of fishery catch rates that occurred as of last year. And you can see that each of those earlier years was revised downward, in some cases quite a bit, when additional data were added the following year. And in fact, that dashed red line at the end of this time series, the lowest line, was our estimate of what might happen last year when we got the rest of the data through 2024. However, during 2025, we undertook a fairly large revision to the commercial fishery catch rates. This included improvements to the hook spacing relationship, addition of historical records, and some extensive error checking going all the way back into the 1990s. This lower graphic then shows you the updated series in black, extending all the way to 2025, reflecting all of those various changes. And you can see that over the past years that this revised series has actually split the difference in some of those estimates from previous years. And importantly, it didn't show a further reduction to 2024. We actually ended up with a value that was quite close to the preliminary value we had last year. And I'm highlighting this because this was a point of much interest last year, as it had a large effect on the stock assessment. And I'll get back to this point when I get to the modeling results in a few minutes. Still at the coast-wide level, if we move into some of the biological characteristics of the catch, this is the average weight of a landed Pacific halibut by IPHC regulatory area, with the coast-wide trend shown as the dark black line down the center. You can see that the average weight declined from somewhere in the low 30-pound range to somewhere below 25 pounds around 2010 or 11. And since then, although there have been some ups and downs, it's been relatively stable. We tend to see the same areas at the higher and lower ends of this spectrum. IPHC regulatory area 2A tends to catch the smallest fish on the coast on average, and 2C tends to catch the largest fish. Those are the red series at the bottom and top, respectively, at the end of the time series. Now, the size of fish that's landed is a combination of both the age structure of the catch and the size at age of the catch. This graphic shows you the changes in weight at age for female Pacific halibut going all the way back into the 1930s. The ages that are represented here from bottom to top are ages 8 to 16, which are the most important components of the commercial fishery and have been over the last 100 years. You can see quite clearly here that we had very large size at age in the late 1970s. That was preceded by very low size at age in the 1930s and 40s. And then since the 70s, we had a long, slow decline through the mid-2000s in size at age. And in recent years, we've seen some recovery of particularly the younger ages to slightly higher weight at age at the end of the time series. Now, this is a pattern that changes relatively slowly. And I would say at the end of the time series, we're starting to see some mixed trends with some of the youngest ages, although they've improved over the last few years, are actually trending back down again. And some of the older ages are beginning to track upwards slightly. This, of course, has a huge effect on the amount of yield that's available to the commercial fishery, because for the same number of fish being landed back in the 1970s, we were looking at 2 to 3 times more yield for the same amount of fish same number of fish being landed. So this has had a huge effect on the amount of surplus production or yield that's available to the commercial fisheries. Looking then into the age structure of the fishery independent setline survey catch, this graphic shows you age on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. Each circle represents the proportion of the catch of the survey in that year and at that age. So a diagonal pattern of larger circles indicates a year class moving through the stock. And in this particular case for the setline survey, we have all males and females are all delineated at sea because we're sampling all of these fish. I'll highlight the 2025 column here on the right, in particular the 8 and 9-year-old fish. Those were the 2 most abundant age classes in the fishery independent setline survey catch in 2025. And these represent the 2016 and 2017 year classes. And we've been tracking the 2012 year class, which was also notable in the setline survey results. And we had noted the emergence of the 2016 year class last year, although it was still somewhat uncertain. This is really the first good look that we've gotten at the 2017 year class. If we look then at the commercial fishery ages, same graphic. The only difference on the right is that we don't have sex-specific information for all years. We only have that sampling program began in 2017, and because it requires a genetic analysis at our lab, it lags 1 year. So from 2017 to 2024, we have sex-specific information, and then for 2025, we've not yet run those genetic samples. I'll highlight here that the same 2 year classes were prominent in 2025 in the commercial fishery. Those are the 8 and 9-year-olds. And they were in such high proportion that we actually saw a relatively sharp drop in the average age in the commercial catch. So the graph on the left shows you just the average age from the early 2000s in the commercial fishery landings. That is averaged pretty close to 14 years old over this whole time series. But dropped by a couple of years in 2025, really indicating this fairly rapid shift from these older year classes to the younger year classes. Now, Dr. Webster already showed you the trends by region. This is the all sizes weight per unit effort from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. I won't go through this graph in detail, but I want to point out that this provides our best estimate of the current distribution of the stock as well. So when we take these estimates from the setline survey and convert those into estimates of distribution for the stock across our biological regions, this is what things look like. So from the top right, you see biological region 3 increased somewhat from 2024 to 2025. However, it still remains relatively low compared to where it was historically. Historically, we saw about 2/3 of the stock in biological region 3. And over the last 10 years, we've seen closer to 50% of the stock in that biological region. Conversely, in the bottom right, biological region 2, we see there was a relatively sharp decrease in this proportion of the stock occurring in Region 2. Somewhere between 22 and 36% of the stock is estimated to be in Region 2. However, despite that decrease, we still estimate that that's a relatively large proportion compared to what we saw, say, from the late 1990s through the mid-2000s or 2010. In the upper left, biological region 4 continues to increase in its proportion of the overall stock distribution. And in the bottom left, biological region 4B also continues to increase. However, I would note, as Dr. Webster did, that we only sampled 30 stations in biological region 4B in 2025. And therefore, the confidence intervals around our estimate of stock distribution range quite broadly in proportion to the amount of stock that's there. So somewhere between 5 and 10% of the stock is likely currently occurring in biological region 4B. Now, I'm taking some of this information that I've shown you at the coastwide level and putting this all into one slide. So this is the same information. From left to right, we have the coastwide survey index of 032 weight per unit effort, the commercial fishery index. Again, I've shown you those two plots already. In the upper right is the TCEY and the mortality accruing to the TCEY in gray, so we can see how close the combined mortality is coming to the limits. And then the only thing new on this slide in the bottom right is the distribution of the mortality across fishery sectors as of 2025. So that last gray bar on the right there is represented in the pie chart. And what that shows you is that approximately 2/3 of the landings, or 2/3 of the mortality coastwide occur from the directed fishery landings. Approximately 16% from the recreational fishery, and 13% from the non-directed discards. So I'm going to step now relatively quickly through one of these dashboards for each of the IPHC regulatory areas. So from south to north, beginning with IPHC regulatory area 2A, you have the survey trends on the left, the commercial fishery trends, and here you see there was a relatively large drop in the tribal fishery catch rates and a small increase in the non-tribal fishery catch rates, leading both of those to be pretty close to the lowest catch rates for IPHC regulatory area 2A we've observed. In the upper right, you can see that in IPHC regulatory area 2A, the combined mortality has been below the overall limit since around 2019. However, it's actually been getting closer to that limit over the last several years. And then in the bottom right, you can see the distribution of mortality. Here in IPHC regulatory area 2A, it's primarily commercial fishery landings and recreational harvest. Moving then to regulatory area 2B, the survey has been trending down for around 10 years, and the commercial fishery indices for both fixed and snap gear have been showing a similar trend, with a slight increase in the snap gear trend for 2025. For regulatory area 2B, you can see that the mortality accruing to the TCEY has been very close to the limit in virtually all years, going all the way back to 2013, and just slightly below in 2020, and again this year projected to be slightly under the combined TCEY in 2025. In regulatory area 2B, around 3/4 of the total mortality come from the directed commercial fishery landings. Regulatory area 2C, again, similar declines in both the survey and the commercial fishery as we saw in regulatory area 2B. Very close to the combined limits across virtually all years with the exception of 2020. And in the bottom right there, you can see that the mortality in regulatory area 2C is almost evenly split between the directed commercial fishery and other sources, with the recreational fishery comprising almost all of the other sources of mortality. IPHC regulatory area 2A. Here I would flag that there was perhaps a notable difference in the trend from 2024 to 2025, with the fishery independent setline survey being up 5%, but both the fixed and snap gear indices being down by 16% from 2024 to 2025. Both of these series showed a relatively flat period up until about the last 5 years. And then within the last 5 years, we've been at or very near the lowest indices of catch rate that we've seen in both the survey and the commercial fishery at 3A. Some Mixed trend with regard to fishery limit attainment. This fishery in 3A has been both above and below over the years, but generally over the last 5 years has been slightly below the combined TCEY. Again, here we have about a 2/3, 1/3 split between landings, directed fishery landings and recreational fishery. In IPHC regulatory area 3B, we had a steeper decline historically in the catch rates, and then more of a flat trend over almost the last decade. Here we see some mixed trends between the survey being up 7%, the fixed gear, and the snap showing opposite trends in 3B. IPHC regulatory area 3B has been consistently over the last 6 years slightly below its combined TCEY, but the mortality levels have generally tracked that TCEY both up and down over that 6-year period. The vast majority of the mortality in regulatory area 3B occurs from the directed fishery landings at 82%. IPHC regulatory area 4A. Again, here we see some divergence between the survey trends and the commercial fishery trends, with the survey being up 3%, but both the fixed and the snap trends being up considerably more at 35 and 54%. However, both of these series still remain at or fairly close to the lowest that we've seen in the time series. In regulatory area 4A, you can see that historically it's almost always been below the combined TCEY limit, with that pattern becoming more pronounced since 2020. The mortality distribution across sectors as of 2025 was 56% directed commercial fishery landings and approximately 40% non-directed discards. So a different split out west than we're seeing in some of the other areas. Moving into IPHC regulatory area 4B, similar to 4A, we saw more positive trends in the commercial fishery than we did in the survey. However, both remain pretty close to the lowest values we've observed in the time series. In the upper right, you can see that in regulatory area 4B, it has been below the TCEY in all but one of the years that we've seen since 2013. And particularly since 2019, we've seen a slow decline in the mortality in IPHC regulatory area 4B that does not track exactly with the TCEYs that have been set. We've seen a continued decline in that mortality, even though we've had some ups and downs in the TCEYs for this area. The mortality itself as of 2025 was divided between the commercial fishery landings at 60% and non-directed discards at 40%. Finally, in the north, IPHC regulatory area for CD and E, we've seen about a 10-year decline in the survey trend with a slight uptick at the end of that time series of 6%. We've seen a similar decline in the commercial fishery trends. However, both the 4C fixed and snap as well as the 4D fixed trends were up slightly from 2024 to 2025. Again, in 4CD and E, we see that the mortality accruing to the TCEY has been below that TCEY since 2020 and does not appear to be tracking the TCEY itself particularly closely. The distribution of mortality in 4CD and E is approximately 80% non-directed discards, 19% commercial fishery landings. Now, I do want to provide a little bit more detail on the survey trend that we have for IPHC regulatory area for CD and E. We've had a lot of questions about the fishery's ability to access the fish in 4CD and E and whether the survey trend is really reflective of the biomass that's available to the fisheries in regulatory area for CD and E. So this next graphic shows you that same trend that I showed you on the last slide. However, it's broken down across the different spatial components of IPHC regulatory area for CD and E. The first three components reading from the bottom up, the darkest bar is the 4D edge, then the Pribilof Islands, St. Matthew Island, the southern Bering Sea flats, and then the northern Bering Sea flats. To identify those a little bit more clearly, the 4D edge, the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island is historically where virtually all of the commercial fishery harvest occurs in regulatory area for CD and E. These are areas of higher density that are accessible to the fishery. And you can see that there's been a very large decline in the biomass associated with those areas. The bulk of the biomass has, over this whole time series, and especially in the most recent few years, has occurred in the vast majority in the northern and southern flats of the Bering Sea. These are areas of low Pacific halibut density. So it's a broad area, but it's a very small, it's a very low density, and therefore it's not, these fish are not available to the commercial fishery unless they aggregate around those either the islands or out on the 4D edge. To provide some numbers for this, historically we saw as much as 35% of the biomass occurring on in these areas that were accessible to the fishery. In the last 3 years, we see only 15% of the biomass occurring. So not only have we had a large decrease in the biomass itself, but less of that biomass is distributed into areas that are accessible to the commercial fishery. So I think this is the explanation for how we can be in a situation where we still have a relatively large amount of biomass in the Bering Sea, but yet we can have very great challenges in the fishery's ability to access that biomass. I'm going to move now into some of the modeling results, beginning with the stock assessment process. To refresh your memory, we do a full stock assessment at the IPHC approximately every 3 years. And these stock assessments are built around generally either a major development in the modeling or a major new data source that's available to us. In between those stock assessments, we do updates, which means we're not making any major changes to the treatment of data or the model structure in the years in between our full stock assessments. In 2025, we did conduct another full stock assessment. This is comprised of a two-part process. We develop the proposed changes for the year over the spring. We present those to our scientific review panel in June. They provide feedback on those changes. We then go back and make any changes they've suggested, do any additional analyses, and bring that back to our scientific review board in September, where we go through all the changes that have been made cumulatively throughout the year, and we settle on a final model for that year's stock assessment. After the September SRB panel, there are no additional major changes made to the treatment of the data or the model structure. We stick with that framework and we move forward. So that was the process this year. The improvements that we made for 2025 consisted of a variety of things, and they're listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, just to call out a few and to note that there's a full bridging analysis provided in the SRB documentation. So if you wanted to go through and actually see the effect of each of these changes sequentially on the stock assessment results, you could go back to that June document and see each of those stepwise changes to the stock assessment. A couple things that I'll highlight here. First is that we are now using a revised Pacific decadal oscillation, which we use as a covariate to recruitment. I'll speak more to that in a few minutes when I get to the results. And the next big thing I want to note, I've already mentioned the improvements to the CPUE time series for the commercial fishery. The last thing I want to highlight here is that we've incorporated the updated maturity ogive, which reflects the histology-based estimates that were produced by the IPHC's Biological and Ecosystem Sciences branch. This is a major step forward in our understanding of the reproductive biology of Pacific halibut, and could have been caused a major change in the stock assessment. It turns out that the results we got were consistent enough with those that we had historically that this did not create a major change in the stock assessment. However, this was incredibly important research and gives us really the first modern look at the reproductive potential of the Pacific halibut stock. And you'll hear a bit more of that in our biology presentation later in this meeting. And you can find it in the documents as well. So the stock assessment continues to be based on 4 stock assessment models. And the benefit of this is that each of these models responds differently to new data and to the various changes that occur over time. It provides a more robust framework for estimating both the scale and the trend of the stock, as well as the uncertainty associated with that. The results of each of these 4 models are equally weighted and combined into a single probability distribution that serves as the basis for our assessment results, as well as our projections over the next 3 years. Unlike in the last several years, the 2025 fishery data, when I added them to this year's stock assessment, were largely consistent with our survey information. And I highlight this here because in both the 2023 and 2024 stock assessments, we saw some very strongly conflicting information. In both of those years, the fishery data brought the assessment estimates downward relatively substantially. And so this was definitely something that we were aware of and looking at closely this year, but it did not occur in this year's fishery data. So it was good to see consistency between the survey trend and the fishery trend in the 2025 stock assessment. This graph shows you the estimates of spawning biomass from each of the 4 stock assessment models. You can see we have considerable amount of uncertainty just how big the stock was back in the late 1990s. However, all 4 models estimate that the stock declined relatively rapidly through around 2010, then increased slightly and slowly through about 2016 as the 2005 year class reached maturity. We then saw a further decline in the stock, and we're just starting to see a slight increase at the end of this time series as we are seeing the 2016 and 17 year classes begin to mature over this period from 23, 24, and 25, as these fish are just reaching the first ages at which some of those year classes are beginning to mature. Now, when we combine these 4 models into one probability distribution, shown here as the blue bands, you can see we had that considerable uncertainty in the early 1990s. Overlaid on that are the previous stock assessment results. Each of those black lines represents a previous stock assessment, and the red dots at the end of those stock assessments represent the terminal year spawning biomass from each of the assessments going all the way back to the 2012 stock assessment. And you can see that that dark line at the end goes almost exactly through the point from 2024. It's actually slightly above. It's a little bit hard to see. So the biomass this year is just slightly larger than we estimated for last year, and trending up, but not up rapidly at all. This is just what we're seeing here is just the front edge of the maturity schedule of these 2 year classes that are currently moving into both the survey, the fishery, and the spawning biomass. This graphic shows you the relative recruitment estimates from each of the 4 models. They're all put on the same scale so we can more easily see which were the better and which were the weaker recruitments. You'll recall that we've been tracking the 2005 year class for a long time now, and these fish are largely gone. These fish represent somewhere around 3% of the coastwide landings in the last few years. So those fish are largely gone. Now, since 2005, we've had on average much lower recruitment. We had a slightly larger recruitment in 2012. We've been tracking those fish for several years now and watching them mature. And as of this year, we're now getting a clearer signal about the 2016 and 2017 year classes shown here that current estimates suggest are around similar size as the 2012 year class. Noting that since 2006, these are the only 3 year classes that we've had that are even close to the magnitude of year classes we were getting before that. And to really highlight that, I want to show you the average year class we were getting up until 2005 is at or even slightly above these 2012, 16, and 17 year classes. So a couple of decades ago, what we would have called an average year class are now very important year classes in the stock. And this has had a huge effect on the amount of yield that's available from the stock, as we've had on average much lower recruitment since 2006, and these fish have filled in all the way across the age structure of the stock. So we are relying now on just these 3 year classes at the end of the time series to provide all the yield currently and for the next over the next 3 years. Now, this is a slightly broader look at the recruitment time series. This is the recruitment estimates from each of the 2 long time series models going all the way back into the early 1900s. Obviously, we have more uncertainty as you go farther back in time, but overlaying on this are the periods of the PDO, or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which we have found historically has been correlated with Pacific halibut recruitment. When the PDO is in a positive phase, we tend to have, on average, around 50% better recruitment than we have when the PDO is in a negative phase. And you can see that quite clearly from the late 1940s through the 1970s. We had a low PDO phase, and we tended to have low recruitment over that time series. From the late 70s to the late 1990s, we were in a positive PDO phase, and on average, we had much higher recruitment over that period. We did have somewhat higher recruitment into the early 2000s, but then since then, we've had much lower recruitment. And if you put that in perspective, you can see that those recruits we've had since 2006 have been as low as we've seen going all the way back for many decades. The revision to the PDO series this year, you may recall from last year's time series that we had some potential for some mixed regimes at the end of this time series. The new PDO series suggests that it's probably just been in a low phase since the late 1990s and continues in a negative phase of the PDO, which doesn't necessarily tell us that we're only going to get poor recruitment, but it doesn't suggest that we should be expecting really anything better than that over the next several years, at least until we see a change in this PDO regime. I'll move now into some of the reference point estimates from the stock assessment. So there are two lines on here. The upper line is the estimated spawning biomass that we would have had in the absence of any fishing. So if we weren't fishing on the Pacific halibut stock, it would be fluctuating up and down to a very large degree. And those fluctuations would be driven primarily by recruitment variability and by variability in weighted age. And so this graphic goes back into the early 1990s, but you can see that even the black line, even if we weren't fishing on the stock would have been increasing rapidly into the early 2000s and then decreasing rapidly until around 2010. Then the rate of decrease slows, but we would have had further declines even if we hadn't been fishing on this stock all the way up until 2025. And this would be, again, the combined effects of lower recruitment and reduced weighted age. The line at the bottom of this graphic shows you the actual estimate of spawning biomass. So that includes not only the fluctuations due to recruitment and weighted age, but also the effect of fishing. And so the difference between these two lines is exactly that. It's the effect of fishing. So the harder we fish, the greater the gap between these two lines. And you can see that as of 2011, we had reduced the stock by approximately 70% due to fishing from where it would have been if we hadn't been fishing on the stock. As of the beginning of 2026, we estimate that reduction is approximately 62%. So since 2011, we've actually reduced the effect of fishing on the stock. So we're doing better now in a relative sense than we were in 2011 in terms of the effect of fishing on the stock. However, note that blue line is actually at a lower level than it was in 2011. So the actual spawning biomass in the water is currently at a lower level than we had during 2011, even though we've been fishing less hard on the stock over this time period. And that's because we've had this continued decline, particularly in recruitment over the most recent time period. If we take the ratio of these two lines, that's what we call our relative spawning biomass. And that's what we calculate our reference points from. So the blue line here and the uncertainty is just the ratio of those two lines from the previous graph, showing that we estimate the current status to be at 38% of the amount of biomass we would have had in the absence of fishing. Dr. Hicks will speak a bit more to these reference points when he gets to his presentation, but just to note here that the dashed line represents our B30 reference point, and the solid line and with the red band below it is our B20% reference point. And those would be checkpoints at which we would adjust the reference level of fishing if the stock were to drop below those levels. This next graphic, there's a lot here, so I'll step through each of the various components of this graphic. Similar to the spawning biomass, we have the results from previous stock assessments shown as black lines, and the red dot indicates the fishing intensity that we estimated from the mortality limits adopted in each of those years. To orient you on this graph, the y-axis, the higher up you go on this graph, the harder we're fishing. So you can see that the blue shaded area, which represents the current stock assessment estimates, we estimate that we were fishing the hardest we've been on the stock in that period from around 2005 to around 2011 or 12, when the mortality limits started to substantially bring the level of fishing intensity downward. So those red dots represent the estimates from each of the stock assessments that were conducted at the time. That light green bar shows the reference levels of fishing intensity, first F46, and then over the most recent years, F43. And you can see that those estimates fluctuated around the reference level leading up to the last few years. However, for over the last couple of years, the reductions that the Commission has made to the mortality limits have brought that level of fishing intensity downward. And we estimate that as of 2025, the total mortality on the stock corresponded to an F52%, noting that we do have wide confidence intervals there. Anywhere from 38 to 70% is the plausible range. And that reflects our inability to estimate exactly how many fish are out there. And therefore, when we remove that harvest level from that stock, that translates into a broad level of uncertainty and exactly the level of fishing intensity being exerted. However, I think the important takeaway from this graphic is that we were pretty close to our projected level of fishing intensity from last year's stock assessment, that red dot. And secondly, that the mortality limit reductions that the Commission's made over the last several years have reduced the level of fishing intensity. So even though the stock has continued to drop, essentially the reduction in mortality limits is getting ahead of that. It's actually reducing the level of fishing intensity over the last several years. This table just provides a summary of the various reference points, most of which I've spoken to already in terms of the level of fishing intensity, the level of spawning biomass, the stock distribution, and the overall mortality levels. So to summarize these stock assessment results, the reduced mortality limits enacted by the Commission over the last several years have essentially reached levels that are consistent with the surplus production. And we can tell this because we're getting relatively flat trends at the coast-wide level. We're taking out just about as much as we're gaining on a year-to-year basis over the last couple of years. However, both the fishery and the fishery independent setline survey indices remain at historically low levels. The stock remains at this low productivity level due to low average weighted age, as well as continued low recruitment. We are essentially fishing on 3-year classes now, 2 of which are very young relative to what's normally found in the commercial fishery and in the setline survey. However, despite the current absolute low level of spawning biomass, the stock is still estimated to be above our B30 reference point and our fishing intensity lower than our F43 reference level of fishing intensity. So that concludes this presentation of the stock assessment results. The recommendation here is to note this paper, and also just a reminder that I will return in another presentation to present the harvest decision table and the 3-year stock projections. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Dr. Stewart. Questions? Well, I can start off if nobody jumps. Ian, I wonder if you can perhaps provide a little more context for how we should understand the declines in Region 2. Just sort of thinking about coastwide trends. What any kind of lens you would put on that to help us digest what we're seeing?
Yes, thank you for the question. I guess 2 things. One is the first is that we have had very good survey coverage over most of Region 2 in the last several years. So 2C and 2B, we've had extensive survey coverage. 2A, as Dr. Webster noted, we had some sparse years in there, but I think we had pretty good coverage as well in 2025. So the trends that we're observing in biological Region 2 appear to be real trends. We're seeing a decline in the biomass in Region 2, and as of 2025, a slight decline in the proportion of the stock occurring there. However, the interpretation of that is a little bit challenging because the Pacific halibut stock is quite dynamic. And historically, if we go way back in time, we've seen some large swings in the biomass, or way back in time based on the landings, and then more recently in the biomass. We've seen some large changes in the distribution of the landings and the biomass over the historical period. And as I noted, we're still at a relatively high proportion of the coastwide stock occurring in biological region 2. So I guess I would say that this is what we're seeing in the last few years could be part of the natural fluctuation of the stock from east to west. But we certainly, I don't think that there's an observation component. Whereas out west, particularly in biological regions 4 and 4B, there's a lot of uncertainty due to the survey. In region 2, we're really pretty clearly pretty precisely estimating the trend there. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. And maybe related to that, and this gets back to the back and forth with Dr. Webster over the space-time model results. I'm wondering if you have any perspective on how we should view the minus 10% in area 2A in light of having no FIS data for 2024. And maybe it's just a matter of saying, well, the space-time model helps us put that in perspective. But anything else you'd like to elaborate on there?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think Dr. Webster did a good job answering the general question of how our previous results can be updated. I will note, however, that when we miss a year in the survey, we'll never really know what occurred in that year. We get an estimate from the space-time model. It provides us some information based on the amount of change that we've seen over time at those stations and in those areas. But when we miss something entirely, we've missed a full opportunity to understand what's going on there. So I would say that it's not entirely clear exactly what the trend has been to get us, particularly in 2A, to 2025. However, as Dr. Webster pointed out, we have seen a pretty consistent decline across all of Region 2. And our tagging information suggests that these fish are likely mixing both within and among calendar years across the full biological region. So I would be surprised if the trend were very different in Region 2 than what we're tracking much more precisely in Region 2B and 2C.
Okay. Thank you. And then for 3A, how should we reconcile the FIS 032 weight per unit effort projection, which is plus 5%, with the commercial fixed and snap gear weight per unit effort being minus 16%? That's a pretty big gap.
Thank you for the question. It is, and I certainly have some concern that due to the reduced footprint of our fishery independent setline survey, there may be some trends going on there that we didn't capture very well in our survey for this year. We still have not gotten back to the levels in regulatory area 3A that we would intend to hit on a base block design survey, sort of our baseline level that we would expect to provide solid monitoring on a year-to-year basis. So it's possible that part of that disconnect could be due to the survey footprint. It's also possible that part of that disconnect could be due to this change in the age structure of the stock. These younger fish, IPHC regulatory area 3A tends to see very small fish for their age. And it could be that those fish that were captured in 3A or those fish that weren't captured in 3A in the commercial fishery may have been below the minimum size limit. And so that there could be some interaction with the biology there that could lead to a steeper decline in the commercial fishery than we would see in the combined survey overall. However, when we isolate it down to just the 032 components, and we still see some difference there. And so, I guess I don't have a clear explanation for that. But just to note that over time, we have tended to see a similar trend. So I would expect that over the next year or the year after, we see one or both of those series coming back together again.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate your reminder about the sort of the gap between what we actually surveyed and the base block design, and that we potentially could be missing something by doing that reduced survey. That's a really good observation. Okay, last questions for me is, I understand you've, and I may not be phrasing this quite right, but you've been continuing to incorporate potential additional changes in our understanding of the maturity rate into your work and your projections. And can you just describe for us how that is likely to affect the assessment and when we as commissioners will see that?
I can, and thank you for the question. We did include the revised maturity schedule in this year's stock assessment. I have some additional slides that I could present to you at some point during the agenda here, or I could add those for the annual meeting if you wanted to see the actual the bridging steps when we added that. But to summarize, the updated maturity schedule suggests that Pacific halibut actually mature slightly younger than we thought they did historically, and that increases the level of spawning biomass slightly, and also tends to buffer some of the ups and downs in the spawning biomass trend, particularly where the biomass is truncated to younger age classes. So those results are already included in the results you see here. They were largely offset by other changes in the model and other updates to data. And so there was no real strong signal there. As you'll see in the presentation from the biological program, the difference was relatively minor. But again, that's already included, and so that is the big change for this year, was that it really didn't create as big a change as it might have. I will note that this is only the first part of our look at the reproductive potential of the Pacific halibut stock. The next components are going to be fecundity and potential for skip spawning, and those at the recommendation of our scientific review board, and just due to the fact that there's a lot more work to be done, those are likely to be introduced into the stock assessment at the next full stock assessment in 2028.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that. Neil.
Thank you. And thanks for the presentation, Dr. Stewart. I had a question about slide 10 that showed the size at age time series. And I noticed that compared to the earlier sections of the time series, the most recent, say, I don't remember exactly what, maybe 10, 15 years, there's quite a bit of, well, maybe more like 15 or 20 years even, there's quite a bit of compression in the lines. And I wondered, like, is this an effect of data? Or does it give you any cause for concern about potential effects of fishing in terms of how the average size at age is different among the ages in any given year? Just interested in your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's probably two contributing factors. The first one, and the simpler one, is just that the data are particularly sparse the farther back we go in time. And so these are smooth curves, and there's less and less data as we go back farther in time. And so I think that the much of the variability that you see in the most recent period from the late 1990s onward is more reflective of the actual dynamics than just the smoothing across sparse data. So some of that is just not having enough information to really inform the small differences between ages as we go farther back in time. We know the fish were definitely big for their age back in the late 1970s. Could there have been more variability among the ages than we're representing in this graph? Definitely. In terms of the second part, I think what we're starting to see at the end of this time series is more of a cohort-specific effect rather than a temporal effect. So we're starting to see certain age classes growing at a different rate, and not just whole-scale changes across all age classes at a particular time. And I guess I don't really have a good explanation for that, other than to say that understanding the factors affecting weighted age is at the top of our research priorities moving forward. After reproductive biology, this is probably the most important thing we can be studying But it is a challenging topic, and we've got a lot of work to do to try to understand what's driving this. There's already been a lot done, and we have not come up with any easy explanations for the factors that are affecting size at age.
I think the latter part of your comment gets to this, like the lines at the end starting to diverge for some age classes. Am I understanding you correctly there? Like cohort specific effects, like the last 5 years for age 8 fish looks very different than the last 5 years for age 16 fish.
Yes. And I think that probably there would have been some of that was occurring historically as well, and we just don't have the resolution of the data to measure it. So I'm not sure that it's concerning. I just think it reflects better information over this most recent time period.
Okay, thank you.
Bob?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Stewart. Ian, on the 2016 and 17 year classes, if you were to throw a dart, how much of those are recruited? I assume they're pretty low percentage, but do you have an idea? Or
Yes, thanks for the question. I think it raises an important point, which is that both of these year classes are still uncertain. Even the 2016s at 9 years old, we've really only seen that year class a couple of times. So are we going to see those estimates be revised in the near future? It's possible. I think we probably have a better estimate of the 2016s than we do the 2017s. There are a couple of factors that make it challenging. One is that we've only seen the year classes a couple of times in the data when they're 8 and 9 years old. And the second is that because we continue to see changes in size at age, we have different levels of each of these cohorts getting above the minimum size limit. So effectively, the selectivity of our fishery changes over time as size at age changes, because more or less of these fish are available to the fishery above that minimum size limit. So I think we will certainly see more of these fish recruiting to the stock, but those fish are already included in, when I get to the projections for the next 3 years. And I wouldn't anticipate, for example, I would not anticipate a major revision upward in the magnitude of these 2 year classes over the next several years. Although it's possible, I think that's probably unlikely.
thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, not seeing any. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, Chair. That would conclude agenda item 5.2 if there are no additional questions, and we can move on to agenda item 6. And 6.1 is specifically the IPHC harvest strategy policy, which is going to be presented by Dr. Hicks. So if we just have the PowerPoint presentation brought up for agenda item 6.1. Then I'll pass to Dr. Hicks. Over to you, Alan. You can make Alan presenter as well, please.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wilson. Okay, well, good morning, almost afternoon here, commissioners, and thanks for holding on, being a part of this meeting today. I'm very excited to present to you a short update on the IPHC harvest strategy policy. And before I do that, I just want to note that there are 2 documents associated with this agenda item. We've split them out into 11A and 11B, and they're both first revisions. 11A is more of an info document describing a lot of the work that's been done and gone into the development of the harvest strategy policy. And 11B is the draft harvest strategy policy itself. So there are also some recent edits, very minor recent edits noted in red in document 11B as well, which we'll discuss briefly. So the purpose of this presentation today is to review the updates and notable changes that have been completed this year in the draft harvest strategy policy. And again, that's document 11B linked here. And to seek adoption of that harvest strategy policy. And then to also outline future MSE work that would support the harvest strategy policy. So that is to note that adopting the harvest strategy policy doesn't put it in stone, but it adopts the document. And then as more work and more information comes in, there's opportunities to update that document to reflect current conditions and current management practices. So what is a harvest strategy policy? I just want to give a really brief review. There is a paragraph on this describing it on page 7 in the draft, I believe, but it's basically a framework for making decisions to achieve conservation and fishery objectives. So the harvest strategy policy is really an outline document. It's a really high-level document describing objectives and the general process of management and how those management how the different tasks were determined. And so the documents, this high-level document, and then one thing we'll do in the future after adoption of the harvest strategy policy is develop more guideline documents or operational documents as well to get into some of the real specifics of these things. So the harvest strategy policy draft has been in progress for a number of years. But in this last year, we've had 3 workshops with the commission, which went really, really well and made major improvements to the draft. But we've also had 2 reviews from the Management Strategy Advisory Board and 2 reviews from the Scientific Review Board. What I want to do is just briefly go over some of the outcomes related to the harvest strategy policy from those 2 subsidiary bodies, and then note some notable changes. So the Management Strategy Advisory Board, or the MSAB as I call it, met twice. We had a formal meeting in May, MSAB 21, and then we had an informational session in October of 2025. The MSAB in general basically agreed to continue investigating the objectives and actually provided some wording on the priority objectives, which the commission then subsequently saw during their workshops and modified appropriately for their needs. The more recent informational session in October, the MSAB was very interested in depleted concept, which I'll go over a little bit shortly, but then also provided some really useful edits on providing clarity, such as the description of overfishing and in the rebuilding sections. So the MSAB has been very helpful, not only in the early development of the harvest strategy policy and MSE that supports the harvest strategy policy, but also in the draft and providing insights into how to improve that draft. The Scientific Review Board met in June and September of this year, and they focused on a few different things. One, in June, they really focused on the concepts of overfished and depleted, which I will go into shortly. And they recommended adopting a depleted level below which recovery projections would be unreliable. And I'll define that for you in more detail shortly. In September, the SRB really focused on overfishing and again helped provide some specific descriptions of overfished and depleted. And those are really 2 of the biggest notable changes to the harvest strategy policy. So we'll go into some details on those. So since the last annual meeting, so in January 2025, some notable improvements to the harvest strategy policy include succinct language for the 3 hierarchical priority objectives, and that occurs on page 10. There's a paragraph on performance metrics also on page 10. And then a definition of overfishing, which is supported by the SRB. And then the SRB helped adding a description of depleted, and that's on pages 12 and 15. There's also a schedule of the annual and triennial process. So this is basically a schedule of events that occurs over the period of years, such as when would the MSE inform the harvest strategy policy, when would the assessment be updated, the operating model, and then when would it be when is it expected that updates occur to the harvest strategy policy? And then finally, some clarifications to a rebuilding plan occur on page 20, noting that the details of how to develop a rebuilding plan are not in the draft harvest strategy policy and are expected to be a separate document after the adoption of this harvest strategy policy. So I want to go over today two concepts from the notable list there, and one of them is overfishing. And the SRB made a recommendation in September that the definition of overfishing be tied to the FMSY proxy rather than a probability of being overfished or depleted. And this really separates those two concepts and keeps the definition of overfishing as a concept that's really supporting maximum sustainable yield, or you're not going to fish harder than what would support maximum sustainable yield. So the definition that we worked with the SRB on is when the annual fishing intensity is higher than the level required to sustain maximum sustainable yield. And the MSY fishing intensity is currently FSPR equals 35%. Now that's based on recent research. And so we also noted that this level could be updated in the future as more information becomes available. So how is this, I do want to note one thing is that in this definition that we worked on with the SRB in the recent weeks, we noted that it might be useful to specify when the median annual fishing intensity, that just makes it more clear exactly what we're talking about, and the median being the central point of the estimated FSPR level. So what does this mean for the commission and how the commission may interpret the what an overfishing level is? And we can actually go to the decision table, which Dr. Stewart will present shortly. And what in that decision table in the rightmost column, or the highest level of catch presented by default in the decision table, is the overfishing limit, or this F35%. And noting that this is the median SPR level. So if there were columns added to the right being higher catches, that would qualify as overfishing. So it's just an easy way to see what, if the commission's considering catch levels that would fall under overfishing, you can look at the decision table to see if there are any available or under consideration. So now let's move on to what this concept of depleted means. So in June, the SRB made a recommendation that the Secretariat Commission adopt an absolute biomass limit, absolute being the actual spawning biomass, not a relative quantity. Defining depleted, which is to avoid low biomass levels where stock dynamics are poorly understood, such that recovery projections would be unreliable. Now, that's how the SRB phrased this concept of depleted as being below a level where recovery projections would be unreliable. You can think of that in a number of different ways as a zone of the spawning biomass that is scary, or that is a zone where recovery may not be, it may not occur under the normal rebuilding strategies that we have. So it's basically an absolute spawning biomass we want to avoid. So I want to go over this concept and show you how this fits into with the estimated and the spawning biomass from the stock assessment. Dr. Stewart has presented both of these figures in the presentation he gave shortly ago. And so I'm going to review them briefly, showing that on the left plot, we have an unfished level, which is the estimated spawning biomass from the stock assessment if fishing had never occurred on the Pacific halibut stock. And as Dr. Stewart noted, that quantity changes over time. So that the halibut stock is dynamic. There are forces out there other than fishing that causes changes to this biomass. The actual estimated spawning biomass from the stock assessment, or with fishing, is that blue line. And then if we take the blue line, divide that by the black line, we get relative spawning biomass, or stock status is what it's also commonly referred to. Now, the draft harvest strategy policy has an overfished level defined in it at this time. And that overfished level is 20% of the unfished level. So if we look on the rightmost plot, we see the red line is showing an overfished level at 0.2 or 20% relative spawning biomass. And we can translate that line onto the absolute spawning biomass on the left, and just basically taking 20% of the black line. And so you see the red line is also dynamic in absolute spawning biomass sense. So it's a moving target, you might say, on absolute sense, but it's a constant target on relative spawning biomass. And that's really useful because what the overfished level is doing is it's really telling us the effect of fishing. Is fishing taking us to a level such that we would call it overfished? And it's accounting for the environmental factors. However, those environmental factors may be important in driving the spawning biomass to low levels where catch rates become too low or lower than desirable, or even the stock might get to low levels where reproduction is more uncertain. And so we can define this level that we're calling depleted on the absolute spawning biomass level and saying, and I've chosen just an example level here for the horizontal purple line on the left there. And let's say that's 70 million pounds. And we really are not certain what will happen to the stock if the spawning biomass got below 70 million pounds. And we really want to avoid that level. The environment may take it to that level even without fishing. That's very unlikely, but that's a level that we want to just avoid. And so what we're working on now is defining what that level of depleted should be. So again, if we translate a constant level of absolute spawning biomass to relative spawning biomass, we see that it's changing over time on the relative scale. And so the purple line on the right is changing over time. And so they're measuring two different concepts here. Overfished is really getting at what is the effect of fishing and can it be mitigated with management? The depleted level is saying this is a combination of the effect of fishing and the environment, and we may need more than just management. We may need a little bit of change in the environment or something like that to improve the spawning biomass. So with that, the SRB worked with the Secretariat in providing 2 paragraphs to the draft harvest strategy policy shown here. I won't go over them in detail, but they occur on page 15. And both of these paragraphs are defining the 2 concepts that I just described to you. Overfished being a relative limit reference point, that is the effect of fishing and accounts for the environment, therefore may be fully mitigated by management actions. Depleted, on the other hand, also includes that natural variability in the stock size and is really to avoid a level for which recovery without a change in environmental conditions may be unknown. And therefore, depleted state may only partially be mitigated by management actions. These paragraphs appear in the draft harvest strategy policy, but as I noted, there's still some more work to do on depleted. There has not been an appropriate threshold defined, nor has there been management actions as we get closer to that depleted level if we were to. And so there's a footnote in the draft harvest strategy policy as well that indicates depleted is a concept, a work in progress, and this will be updated in future versions. Okay, the final concept I want to cover here is the reference fishing intensity. And you've heard Dr. Stewart mention this already when he was showing the retrospective of historical fishing intensity in his presentation. And he noted that the current reference fishing intensity is an SPR of 43%, but he also noted that in some years it was 46%. The MSE work has supported a reference SPR of 43%, would meet all of the objectives defined by the commission. But more recently, and this was last October, the MSEP recommended an SPR of 46%. And the reason that they recommend an SPR 46% is, one, it meets all of the objectives, but it would also reduce the probability that the spawning biomass in the future, in the next 4 to 10 years, would be less than the 2023 spawning biomass. And it also resulted in a lower interannual variability. Another point here is that the commission has been setting recent mortality limits at SPRs near 51%. So they've been departing from that reference level. And actually, when we first brought in the concept of reference fishing intensity, the report from the annual meeting referred to it as a handrail from which the commission may depart. And that's the flexibility of the commission defined in the harvest strategy policy. However, some of these recent decisions by the commission in low fishing intensity, or SPRs near 51%, has been more, seems to be maybe a result of low productivity scenarios, and the commission has been interested in learning more about management during a low productivity scenario. So I'm going to describe a little bit about that on the next slide. But first, I just want to remind the commission that even though we're still learning about the reference fishing intensity and how that responds in a low productivity scenario, as with the overfished and depleted concepts, the reference SPR may be updated in after adoption of the harvest strategy policy. So here's a little bit of MSE results supporting different reference fishing mortalities. And if we take a look first at the axes on this plot, we have the variability in the TCUI, where a lower value is better on the Y or the vertical axis on the left there. And then we have the actual short-term TCUI. That's the TCUI that would be simulated in the next 4 to 10 years on the X or horizontal axis. And that is a value higher is better. So we're really looking at the trade-off between these two concepts, which is actually combined as a third objective in the draft harvest strategy policy. The black line shows simulations integrating over both low and high productivity regimes. And so what you can see is that a higher fishing intensity, like 35 or 40% SPR, results in a higher mortality limit, but also a higher amount of variability or change from year to year in that mortality. And the variability in the TCY is minimized around or between SPR values of 43 to 52%. We can also do these simulations assuming it's always a low productivity regime. So we simulate forward in time, saying it's always a low PDO and always low weighted age. And then we would get the green curve. The first thing you'll notice from the green curve is a much lower TCUI, more similar to the TCUIs that have been set in recent years. But what I really noticed about this trade-off curve is that the trade-off is very similar in that the optimal SPRs are still falling between 43 and 52% for this trade-off. It's just shifted over because of the low productivity regime. Okay, so with that, we have a draft harvest strategy policy that is complete, but I've noted some additional work that needs to be done in it, and that can be updated in the future. So the next steps are really to adopt that draft harvest strategy policy here at the IM101 with any final edits suggested by the commission. And then at the annual meeting coming in January is to consider what the next steps are to support any updates to the harvest strategy policy. And we can define those things at the 102nd annual meeting. Things like that could include in the MSE program of work, but also maybe even schedule when the first review and update of the harvest strategy policy will be. So with that, potential recommendations are one, to note the paper 11A that provides this update on the draft harvest strategy policy and the MSE work supporting it. And then to adopt the harvest strategy policy in a document 11B and possibly note any updates to the reference fishing intensity and definition of depletion or depleted that may occur in 2026 following further work by the secretary. So with that, I hope you found this informative, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Let's start with Richard.
Thanks, Alan, for that presentation. So I just want some clarification regarding the SPR in the harvest strategy plan. So first of all, how was the 43% SPR arrived at? Is it an arbitrary kind of a number based upon history? And by changing it from 43, if we change it from 43 to 46, does that change anything in the decision table, or is this already, it is in the decision table. Now we just, we're looking at 46 instead of 43. How is that change the decision table and all the everything in there, all the decision points and risks?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Yamada. Really good questions. The SPR, the current reference SPR 43%, was agreed upon by the Commission, I believe in 2018. And that was a direct result of the MSE simulations and results and MSAB recommendations at that time. So it was not based on history, but fully supported by the MSE work. The previous value, SPR 46%, was actually based on history. And Dr. Stewart and I remember the conversation we had. We said, what should the value of SPR be since we don't have MSE results? And we said, what has the Commission done in the most previous 3 years? And I think those were like 2013 to 2015. So this current value is based on MSE results, but those MSE results have since been updated with a new operating model and a new understanding of population dynamics. And so that is partly why the MSAB, when they saw MSE results, decided on making a recommendation to change that to a 46%. There's been updates to the MSE modeling, but also there's been more of a concern about the low productivity regime that we're currently in, and how likely is it that the population would or would decline below levels we've seen recently. And the MSAB felt and made the recommendation that there's a lower probability of spawning biomass continuing to decline or be at levels lower than we've seen in recent years when fishing at an SPR 46%. So it's part of that recommendation was related to that too. Getting at the second part of your question is the decision table would only have a very minor change. The only change in the decision table is what would be called the reference SPR level. And so right now in the decision table that Dr. Stewart will present in the next presentation, you'll see a reference FSPR 43%. And then if the Commission was to make a change to say 46%, the decision table would then say reference FSPR 46%. So no change to the decision table. It might center it differently for a default, but the interpretation remains exactly the same.
Thank you for the clarification.
Maybe I'll just build on that discussion about the reference level a little bit, Alan. So
We lost you, Gerald.
percent.
Yeah, sound kind of.
And you noted that
Commissioner Kurland, your sound is cutting out.
You noted that. Okay.
Okay.
How about now?
Yeah, sounds better now.
Okay, good. Thanks. You noted that last October, the MSAB recommended changing the reference level to 46%. And you also noted that we could approve the harvest strategy policy as it is and then revisit what the reference level is. But is there any reason why the Commission should not change the reference level at this meeting as part of our approval of the HSP?
Thanks, Commissioner Curlin. That's a really good question. And there is one reason that I can't think of to maybe hold off on changing the reference level, especially at this meeting. One, we do have MSE results that are very informative, and the MSAB has made a recommendation. However, following the full stock assessment, the process, which is defined in the schedule within the draft harvest strategy policy, is to then update the operating model that is used for the simulations in the MSE process. And so that'll change the understanding of the halibut population dynamics slightly, and may change the outcomes of the MSE slightly. And so if the commission was desired to use the most recent MSE results, the updated ones, it may be prudent to hold off until 2026 when we've had a chance to update the operating model, redo all the simulations, evaluate them against the current set of priority objectives, have an MSAB meeting, and then consider those sometime in 2026 with the most updated information. It just might avoid changing the SPR level now, and then maybe the operating model suggests something different again in the future. Another reason the commission may want to hold off on the changing the reference SPR now is to have a better or closer look at the productivity regimes and what it means to be in a low productivity, and if management should change in any way. The MSAB's very interested in that concept, and we've been working closely with them, and they have some ideas how to present different things to the commission, which I'll show the commission at the annual meeting.
Okay, thanks. So just to clarify that a bit more, it sounds like you're anticipating that the MSAB may, through some additional analysis in the coming months, potentially have a different recommendation for us than going to 46. Am I hearing that right?
There is that possibility. The operating model has not been updated since 2022. So just as an assessment, when a full assessment is done, some changes may occur. This most recent stock assessment didn't seem to change much, but the operating model may have more of an effect from maturity or something like that, which is yet to be seen. That may feed into the results and then result in a difference from the MSAB. And so then that further understanding of productivity regimes may result in the MSAB having a different recommendation as well.
Okay, but you are anticipating that we would have better clarity on that in 2026. This isn't something that would extend further into the future.
No, by the annual meeting in January 2027, you'll have full updated information with recommendations from the MSAB and SRB.
Okay, thanks. I do have some questions, comments on other parts of the HSP, but let me just see if any other commissioners have anything on the reference level or other points. Bob?
Yeah, Alan, playing off of John's comments on the reference level, a more conservative reference level, if improving this harvest control rule or HSB, and we announce now that that the commission may consider a more conservative reference level to give the MSB and others some indication where we're thinking. Do you have a problem with something like that in adopting the current proposal?
No, I have no issue if the commission would like to discuss the current reference level and change that. And I think it could potentially signal to the MSAB and the SRB the current thinking of the commission as we move forward into analyzing the new results. I do want to note the commission, and there is the flexibility in this harvest strategy policy that, and I use what the reference level has been described as in the past. The reference level is basically a handrail. It's not something that's prescriptive in this harvest strategy policy, but a reference level from which the commission may depart and choose their own mortality limit. And so if it's a 43%, and the commission can still decide on an SPR 50%. If it's a 46%, the commission to still decide on an SPR 50%. There's no issue in that. It's really what is the expectation? What would be the default assumption of the commission if there was no additional supporting information to depart from that reference level? That additional supporting information can be socioeconomic factors, productivity regimes, and things like that, that the commission has the flexibility to make that decision. So the reference level can be seen as that. It's not a problem to update the harvest strategy policy now and update it with that change. And it may give an indication to what how the commission is interpreting those objectives and the current productivity and the current space that the halibut population is in.
Well, we are considering, we don't have any choice but to consider that we're in a very low productivity position right now. And so that's why I am supportive of either adopting a more conservative reference point at this point. And as you point out, if in the future there's the commission is blessed with a more productive resource, then they can alter that. But thanks for your comments. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Alves.
Neil?
Thanks, John. Well, first of all, Alan or Dr. Hicks, I think, actually, I was going to congratulate you, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. We haven't adopted anything yet. Anyway, for getting us this far, I think that's been a lot of work. I had a couple questions. At one of our workshops, we had talked about seeking more description from you about how all of these elements of a harvest strategy policy might interact. In particular, I'm thinking of having both relative and absolute biomass metrics, plus definitions or elements of our strategy that address overfishing, overfished, and depleted, sort of as reference points, and how those may interact or act together to shape the advice that might get generated out of this. And so I wondered if I was looking at this slide with the recommendations and the kind of next steps that are described in clause 2, and wanted to confirm that you envision being able to sort of put something together that might speak to that, because I think it will inform choices about what elements we want to include, and just an understanding of how it will all work together. So that was my first question.
Do you mind, Commissioner Davis, if I tackle that one now? That's a big question.
Please, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a really good question. And, you know, it is actually what I like most about this harvest strategy policy, is that we have these three concepts, these three reference points: overfished, overfishing, and depleted. They're all slightly different facets of how the management of Pacific halibut should occur. Overfished is avoiding that level that's low and as a result of fishing. Depleted is having a response when the stock gets really low and some major concerns occur. And then overfishing is really avoiding high fishing intensities such that we can maintain a maximum sustainable yield. So each of the concepts have a slightly different take on it in terms of the management. how the management responds to each of those concepts. Well, for overfished, we have a control rule, the 30-20 control rule. And what that's doing is reducing fishing intensity as the stock approaches an overfished level. Overfishing is just something to be avoided, which can be seen in the decision table, as I pointed out. And the part that needs a little bit of work still, and that I'm pretty excited about working on, is how the management responds to the level of depleted. So one, how do we define what depleted means? And then how do we define the management response as the stock either approaches or goes below a depleted level? And that is where I think some discussion, some simulation work, discussion with the SRB and discussion with the commission is still necessary. And that's why the footnote appears in the harvest strategy policy. But I'm happy to put together more information on that. We can cover that at the annual meeting to appropriately develop a work plan, and one that really gets at the needs of the commission in helping understand how to shape, especially the depleted concept in this harvest strategy policy. Does that help with your question?
Yeah, thank you. And I definitely look forward to hearing more about that. My next question was also thinking about what we might want to include in terms of where to from here. And you mentioned it earlier in the presentation, but I wondered if we wanted to capture it as one of the things for further work is just this broader idea of like the low productivity regime, and what about, if anything, our harvest policy might need to be different to reflect how we operate in that environment versus the rest of the time. So was curious where you see that fitting in relative to these other pieces about the reference fishing intensity, the definition of depleted, and so on.
Yeah, that is a very good question, Commissioner Davis, and one that I would be happy to investigate. I think there's a lot of interest in the MSAB, and I'm hearing some interest from the commission to investigate this. And so we've started that research and working with MSAB members on different ways to present this. And so I think that would be a very useful addition to the MSC work plan, and then figuring out how that fits into the harvest strategy policy. I think the first step there is just one, understanding how these productivity regimes change the population, the dynamics of Pacific halibut under different management scenarios. Once we get a good understanding of that, then we can develop the necessary management responses, differences, put those into the harvest strategy policy.
Alan, just on that point, I recall during the work meeting, I opined about, well, might there be advantages to having a different reference level for a low productivity regime compared to when the regime changes and we want a higher reference level. And if I recall right, I thought you advocated for choosing a reference level that's more robust to both scenarios. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's the typical way forward in fisheries management. There's been some work that have suggested that you can get it wrong as often as you get it right in determining what productivity regime you're in, or your response may be lagged. And so there hasn't been a lot of benefit seen in trying to always adjust your management to the productivity regime, because you're not always sure what the productivity regime is when it does change. You learn eventually that, yep, we're in a low productivity regime, as we see now with Pacific halibut. So that a lot of work does suggest that it's very difficult to respond appropriately to that. However, Pacific halibut's never been managed in a traditional way. I think there's a lot of reasons that we could look into this and determine, can we manage Pacific halibut according to some sort of regime, or respond in ways that are appropriate for the kind of data and the knowledge that we have about Pacific halibut. So I don't want to just brush it off of the table, but past research has suggested it's a very challenging topic and a challenging one. But I think a lot of fisheries agencies are very interested in this type of work, so I'm very happy to do it.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Sorry to jump in there, Neil. Seemed relevant to your point.
Yeah, not at all. I appreciate the follow-up. I have one more question and then a comment, if I may. On page, I think it's page 14 in the, oh gosh, which document was it? I didn't write that part down. It's 14 of the harvest strategy policy. We talk, this is just, I'm hoping you can give me a reminder. We talk about a fishery LRP, the level below which the fishery is not profitable. And I can't remember how we kind of estimate the level at which the fishery is profitable. And it made me think about how different that could be in one area versus the next. It also made me think about the fact that we have some fisheries which are not economic in nature. You know, we have significant recreational fisheries in multiple areas. We have indigenous fisheries that are not necessarily about selling catch. So can you just refresh my memory a bit about how we're thinking about that?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Davis. That's a really good point, and something we just discussed, I think, in the first workshop with the commission this year. One point that was made and a change made to the draft at that time was we have now the phrase, I'm just going to look at it. It says, there's a sentence in there where the directed commercial fishery is unlikely to remain profitable and opportunities for all fisheries would be severely diminished. So what we tried to do was capture that we're not managing just for profit, the Pacific halibut fisheries, but we're also managing for opportunities for all fisheries, including subsistence, recreational, and all different user in the halibut fishery. So we're hoping that that phrase, that entire phrase of profitable and opportunities captures the sentiment of managing to the many different user groups.
Can't hear you, Neil.
Sorry about that. I think that broader language is really helpful. Thank you for reminding me about that. With respect to the sort of profitability piece, how do we tackle that in the context of different areas with perhaps some very different profitability margins or considerations?
Another great point, Commissioner Davis. The current harvest strategy policy is really focused on the coast-wide management of Pacific halibut, where, and I think it's figure 2, showing that the commission decision step in the harvest strategy policy is where the area specific TCYs are determined. And so there's no real specifications for how that distribution occurs at this time and what it means for the different areas. And so the harvest strategy policy is very focused on the coast-wide aspect now. And I think that's a really useful thing. One, because it's good, it can help get the document adopted. And then the distribution stuff occurs as the commission decision-making step. We can in the future consider how the different areas come into this to play, but really I think that falls into the commission decision step, and it's not being currently considered in the MSC simulation, say, for example, what would be providing the most opportunities and profitability for the different fisheries is always looked at on a coast-wide scale. In the future, we can start looking more on a regional basis if desired.
Okay, thank you. And then just one more, this one's short. I think I heard you say that the development of like a rebuilding plan guidance document could be something separate. I would just advocate that I do think that's more sensible than necessarily including all the detail in the harvest strategy policy. I can envision us sort of making adjustments to one but not the other on different time frames, and and it is a fairly different piece. So I like the idea of having the harvest strategy policy refer to rebuilding plan commitments in a broad way and directing the reader to another document where, you know, we can build out the details. So that would be my vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. I agree. And that's actually common practice for many different harvest strategy policies for different fisheries.
Thanks, Neil. Let's go back to Richard.
I just want to follow up on Neil's comments about achieving MSY. And, you mentioned something about including the term opportunities. It seems to me just as vague. I mean, when you're talking about either profitability, you have, a way to measure that quantitatively over history. Maybe you got the coinage to kind of evaluate that. When you get to opportunities, a little bit vague, because we don't have the same terminology or coinage that we can compare. Whether it's indigenous value or recreational value in a fishery, we always come up to the point, well, what is a opportunity and the value of an opportunity, or when does opportunity to a point where it triggers something? Is that going to take a lot of work to determine that level that is quantitative rather than qualitative?
Yes, thanks, Commissioner Yamada. The word opportunity certainly is vague, and I think it's meant to be vague in the context of this harvest strategy policy. And where we work out, so I guess a better definition of opportunities is through the objectives. And that's where the MSAB has been very, very helpful with its diverse group of members representing commercial, recreational, tribal fisheries and interests. We have defined a number of different objectives and reference points for within those objectives to try to get at what opportunities mean. The other part of the MSE process is the trade-offs, the differences between these different user groups. And we've tried to really capture that when in the MSE process and in defining those objectives. When the MSAB looks at the results, they're all coming with a different angle, you might say, or a different viewpoint from these different user groups. And they provide their advice, and we try to come to a consensus within the MSAB. So I think it's useful to keep the phrase opportunities in the harvest strategy policy as a really vague concept, and then tease that out in terms of what the objectives are. And I note the harvest strategy policy has 3 what we call priority objectives. The MSAB is operating under many more objectives. They've defined a lot of objectives and even area-specific objectives that we'll sometimes look at within the MSAB, and the commission, I can present to the commission as desired. So those opportunities come out, and sometimes it might be as simple as, I need the TCUI in my area to be greater than this to provide the opportunity for the users in this area. And we'll look at the MSE results and say, does this type of harvest strategy policy get you to that point, and what would you need? So those are the discussions we have with the MSAB and as part of the MSE process.
Thank you.
Okay, Alan, I have a couple of particulars for you. I wonder if you could pull up paper 11B just so we can look at the language of the harvest strategy policy as I bring up a couple of specific things.
Sure. Would the Secretariat be able to bring up that paper 11B? Great, thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm on page 12.
Okay. Can I navigate? Should be left. Oh, yeah, there we go. Yeah, page 12. Sorry. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit to see if I can. Okay, page 12.
Okay, and right at the top there, the last sentence of the first paragraph about ensuring long-term sustainability and productivity to maximize, I think it's net economic returns. This sort of fits in with Neil and Richard's comments about some benefits not being strictly economic. So I wonder what you would think of saying maximize NER and other benefits as a way to capture that point.
Yes, we can certainly do that. I believe NER was defined earlier. Let me see where that was defined, because I believe the concept of NER does contain that. Sure, I remember exactly where that is. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Commissioner Kurland. I just want to have one quick look and see exactly where the definition of NER is.
It's in the acronyms, it's defined as net economic returns.
Yes, so on page 10, and I'll go to page 10, right in the second paragraph after that, second paragraph after that chapter begins. Here it is. It says, maximizing the net economic returns from the fishery may not always equate with maximizing the profitability of the fishery. Net economic returns may consider interannual stability to markets, economic activity, opportunity for recreational indigenous fishing. I'm not opposed to putting maximize other benefits in that paragraph you're talking about. I just wanted to point out that the concept of NER is trying to capture all of these things, even though it does use the term economic in it.
Yeah, and I guess even in this definition on 10, it does say economic activity may arise from opportunity for recreational and indigenous fishing. I personally, I think on page 12, it'd be better to say maximize NER and other benefits.
Okay, yeah, no problem to do that. That's one of the edits. Maximize NER and other benefits, was it?
Yep.
Not a problem.
Okay, and then my next one is on page 16. So this is under 3.8 in the second paragraph. The sentence that says, therefore, MPs may be reevaluated 3 years after implementation and shall not exceed 2 cycles. I'm afraid I don't follow that sentence. What does that really mean about reevaluating in that time cycle?
Yeah, I see it's a little bit ambiguous, that sentence there. And the meaning of this is that the management procedures may be reevaluated on a 3-year cycle, but they may be, but not necessarily need to be evaluated every 3 years. But if you miss one 3-year cycle, you definitely want to reevaluate the management procedures every 6 years. So you do not want to go more than 6 years without reevaluating the management procedures.
And so what would an example of that be if we're reevaluating a management procedure?
Okay, so let's say the harvest strategy policy is adopted now. We update the operating model in 2026 and we find everything's fine. We're not going to make any changes. Well, the next full stock assessment is going to occur in 28. And then the operating model will be updated in 2029. And so that's 3 years from now. And we may want to reevaluate the management procedures then. So that's sort of why it's on a 3-year cycle. But if we decide, look, we're not going to do the management procedures, we've been working on depleted some other stuff, let's wait another 3 years. Well, let's make sure that we do evaluate this, so that basically we're always looking at the management procedure, like the reference SPR, in a 6-year period and making sure that it remains relevant.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I've got one more before I go to Mark. So this is on page 20.
Okay. Okay, 20.
And sorry, bear with me here.
No problem.
Okay, so this is has to do with the new language that you have there under rebuilding plan. Before a rebuilding plan is implemented, directed fishing and incidental mortality shall be constrained as much as possible to avoid further declines in the RSB. I would omit that entire sentence, and there are 3 reasons. The first is that any such measures would be included in the rebuilding plan itself, and it seems to me that's the mechanism for making management adjustments. It's in the rebuilding plan. The second reason is that the word shall seems too prescriptive here, potentially limiting the commissioner's flexibility. And then third reason is the words as much as possible, I think, go too far. For example, it's possible to reduce fishing mortality to 0 by closing the directed fishery and prohibiting all bycatch. But doing so would be impracticable. You know, we could do it, but there'd be a lot of consequences to that. And then, you know, likewise, at the very top of page 20, you have similar language that says as much as possible. And I don't think that's the right reference. So I would take out that sentence lower down, and also take out as much as possible near the top of page 20.
Yes, thanks, Commissioner Kerlin. The reason that we added this, the sentence in red, was a response to the MSAP. They could not figure out what would happen if, say Dr. Stewart presented a stock assessment and right now that said the stock is overfished. We need to develop a rebuilding plan. Well, it's going to take probably a year for that rebuilding plan to be developed and get into place. And so the confusion with the MSAB was what happens between the time a stock is declared overfished and a rebuilding plan is implemented, which could be 1 to 2 years later. I completely see what you're saying, and that's why the sentence wasn't originally in the harvest strategy policy, as it would be implied that would be up to commissioner discretion, realizing they're overfished. But there was some concern that they just didn't know what would happen in between that time. So
yeah, the commission certainly would retain the flexibility to take management measures as needed in the interim, but it may take a while to actually develop and finalize the rebuilding plan.
Yeah, and so removing this sentence, then in a separate document, say the guidelines for a rebuilding plan, would that then maybe have some specifications for what happens between the time a stock is overfished to the rebuilding plan is developed?
I think it could, yeah.
Okay. Sounds good to me if the commission's good with that.
Right, so seeing some nodding heads.
Good.
Okay, let's go to Mark.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Dr. Hicks, for taking us through this again. I note the again. Certainly appreciate all the discussion we've had so far today and agree with the points raised. I guess the direction I would wish to go here is twofold. First, picking up on where John's left us with regards to rebuilding plans, and wondering whether we might wish to consider the inclusion of perhaps what I characterize as an additional subpoint. So akin to your bolded text there with rebuilding plan and the rebuilding timeframes, including a new one. And I don't have the wording here whatsoever, but that would be a little bit more prescriptive on us, and in that we shall, as a commission, develop rebuilding plan guidance for us to consider in the development of subsequent rebuilding plans if and when those prove necessary. Appreciating full well that we would need to align that to both US and Canadian and domestic policies and regulations and the like. So that's why it would take a little bit of time, but I don't want to lose sight of the need for that guidance for ourselves to be anchored somewhere. And I think that sort of incidentally or tangentially at least works to address some of what John's driving at here, in that there are, and then I was trying to find our own phrasing for our domestic requirements as to what would unfold in those circumstances before a rebuilding plan is available or fully developed. Recognizing that requires input from all participants in the fishery. So, and I wasn't able to find it in fast enough time frame, but we do have those sort of details outlined, but equally we should, avail of those from both our respective domestic regimes and see what's going to fit for ourselves here at IPHC. So that's that one. And then I guess reverting back to the paragraph on net economic return, or the NER sort of reference. Appreciate full well that encompasses both recreational and indigenous fisheries or fishing, but equally it's still a little bit too hinged, in my view, at least, upon economic. And there are equally cultural and social aspects to those fisheries, those latter two fisheries. And wondering if those might be woven in somehow, so that there's a nod there to them. Admittedly, from a data and analytical perspective, we'll often find ourselves defaulting or gravitating more so to the economic side of the ledger, but they should be reflected. And equally, I guess I'd seek to see those addressed in the definition in the annex. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Waddell. It's very insightful. Are these changes you would expect to occur after adoption, or something that we would like to see edited quite quickly?
After adoption's fine.
Okay.
This isn't anything that I would see as delay from my perspective. Again, colleagues may have different views, but I wouldn't see this delaying adoption.
I appreciate that because I think this would be something we could spend a little bit of time working on and to get it really right.
So just to be clear, Mark, is your proposal to adopt this with the understanding that there'll be some additional wordsmithing that we'll agree upon to finalize the language?
Yes, to be clear, I do. At least that's where I would be, but
yep,
obviously that's subject to discussion.
Sure. Okay, appreciate that. Alan, on our exchange we were having just before Mark spoke up about the rebuilding plan, I overlooked something in my notes, which is some potential alternative language that might get at this concept of what do we do while a rebuilding plan is in development. And that would be as an alternative to the sentence I was recommending scratching on page 20. And I'll just read it. It says, while a rebuilding plan is in development, the Commission should consider taking actions to limit or avoid further declines in the RSB, to the extent practicable. So that would sort of convey the intent that the Commission will consider taking action during this interim period while a rebuilding plan is in development. And maybe we can put that in the same category with Mark's suggestion just now. Not, if the Commission is okay with the concept, we could do some wordsmithing offline to finalize that.
Sure, I appreciate that, Commissioner Curlin. So we would remove the sentence in red with an understanding that we'll add a wordsmith sentence in the near future. similar to what you just said.
Yeah, that's my proposal.
I would prefer that so that we get it right.
Okay, any other commissioner questions or suggestions for the document? If not, dare I ask, are we ready to adopt this by consensus? Alan, I think we might be there. You can uncork the champagne.
Well, I certainly appreciate it. This is a real milestone for the commission and something that I think you all should be very proud of.
Well, we greatly appreciate your not only insight and technical guidance on this, but your patience with us along the way.
Like I said, I want to get to the right place.
David, I think that might bring us to public comment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chair. So that's good news and congratulations, Alan. It's fantastic. Yes, so we have one sign up for public comment related to agenda items 5 and 6. And so Secretariat can just give the microphone to Buck Lakaitis, please. Can you hear us, Buck?
Can everyone
ahead,
hear
Buck.
me?
Yes, we can. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Buck Lakaitis. I'm a commercial fisherman in Alaska. Mostly my boats fish in the Bering Sea. Really appreciate the time and attention devoted to the overfished, overfishing, and depleted and rebuilding concepts. Appreciate a lot of the commissioners' comments. Those are, to me, new and are things that some of us asked for at the last annual meeting, and I really appreciate being responsive to that. I do think you need to think about spatial elements, and what I mean by that, wherever you use these terms, it's obvious to me that, for instance, I'm feeling like the Bering Sea is nearing some designation. Call it depleted. I think areas or bioregions need to be considered. Same way if you had a overfishing, depleted situation, however defined in Canada, you wouldn't want to just wait for the whole stock to be in that state. So I think that needs some guidance. Just in general, I think I'm having a hard time connecting some of the dots here. So, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'll just talk in fisherman talk. And it kind of comes down to whatever's coming out of Ian's computer is not what we're seeing on the water. That's the easiest way for me to say it. And we have, I think, unwarranted confidence in an increasingly sparse FISS inputs in the Bering Sea, where I'm talking about. The model tells you we're in a sweet spot, and I think it should show stress. So I'm glad the IPHC staff can sleep at night. I'm actually happy for you, because as I get older, it's actually a good night's sleep is a joy, and I'm jealous, but I'm not sleeping well, and maybe I know too much. I'm going to speak just real briefly about on Ian's stock distribution slide in area 4C, D, and E. I thought that was really interesting. I'm going to offer an alternative hypothesis. This 4C, D, and E shelf break, it's basically divides the Eastern Bering Sea north and south, is to me the most productive fisheries shelf in the world. It's where all the activity is. It's also where halibut spawn. So Ian showed the the breakdown of how there's less and less fish on that edge. But there's still plenty of fish. They're just widely distributed. That's the take home message from that. And that terrifies me, because if the fish aren't in the most productive spots, the core spawning areas where also there's intense fishery activity by other fleets, we really have a problem. And I can't explain that away the way I just have an alternative hypothesis there. And the last point for reflection, if more of the stock is moving west, we're really in trouble. It demonstrates how stressed the stock is. If we're doing well in the west and we can't even catch our fish, which, last year I gave you a report from the fleet at this time, it hasn't gotten any better. 30% of the CDQ got caught this year, and 4 CD&E. I get it. The economics are a little bit different in the Bering Sea, but we're highly incentivized to catch fish. We had over $7 a pound ex-vessel price, and most of the fleet had given up by September. We tried into October, and with very little success. So if more of the stock's moving west, it's troubling because there's a gauntlet of year-round fishery activities. And when I look at this is the last point, and I'll get off, but thank you for your time. So fishery data overview that was presented earlier in the meeting this morning. The U26 non-directed commercial discard mortality in area 4 CD&E, 1.266 million pounds. That's I think the fish are about 1.5 pounds average size. They're small fish, but that's not 1 million fish pieces, animals, but it's 850,000 by my calculation. That's just the U26. And then the O26 is, 1.688 million pounds this year. That's approaching 3 million pounds. And I don't know, it's well over 1 million fish. So the Bering Sea needs your attention. I think we need to go to some spatial ideas that I presented last year. I think we have to look at the Bering Sea as a bioregion, and I will look forward to working with you at the annual meeting coming up in January. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Buck. Chair, that's the only public comment we have on agenda items 5 and 6. Just very briefly, we did have a question on one of the earlier items just about what the total proportion of the U32 catch, total proportion of the 2025 fish catch was U32, and the answer to that was 8.1% of the total fish catch. So I'll just provide that very quickly. But that's all we have, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Dave, I think that brings us to our lunch break. What do you recommend given where we are on the agenda? How much time?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So we're 15 minutes behind schedule at this point, but I think we're probably going to make that up with the remaining agenda items. So if you are still keen to take a 45-minute break, I think that would be perfectly fine.
Okay, let's do that.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we will be back at 1:45. Thank you.